In the wind-swept plains of rural Montana, where the vast wheat fields whispered secrets only the earth could hear, lived a man who understood silence better than most. Thomas Blackwood hadn't heard a single sound in over 15 years, but he could feel the approaching danger long before he saw it. The vibrations through the soil told him things that ears could never detect: the weight of footsteps, the rumble of engines, and most importantly, the distinctive pulse of gunfire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What the ruthless Harding gang didn't realize as they drove up his long dirt road that autumn morning was that they weren't intimidating a helpless deaf farmer. They were challenging a man who had transformed his perceived disability into an extraordinary gift, one that would soon become their worst nightmare. The thugs who mocked him couldn't know that the explosion that took Thomas's hearing in Iraq had also given him something in return: an almost supernatural sensitivity to vibration that made him more aware of his surroundings than any hearing person could comprehend. Before we dive deeper into Thomas Blackwood's story, a tale that will forever change how you think about human potential, let's understand how a man who couldn't hear the threats against him became the most dangerous person these criminals would ever face. The Montana sunrise painted Thomas Blackwood's 200-acre wheat farm in hues of amber and gold as he walked the perimeter of his eastern field. At 58, his tall frame remained remarkably strong, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to exist in a world of vibration rather than sound. His weathered hands, calloused from 15 years of coaxing life from this stubborn soil, moved methodically through the wheat stalks, feeling for the subtle differences in texture that told him more about his crop's health than any agricultural report could. Thomas checked his watch. 5:45 a.m. He'd been up since 4, the same as every day since purchasing this land after his medical discharge. The farm sat nestled in Whitewater Valley, 20 miles from the nearest town of Clearwater, Montana. The isolation suited him. After losing his hearing, the sensory overload of urban environments had become overwhelming. Here, in the open country, he could focus on the vibrations that had become his primary connection to the world. Inside his modest farmhouse, every element had been carefully adapted to his needs. Lights flashed instead of doorbells ringing. Specialized sensors detected movement and translated it to vibration panels installed throughout the home. His phone was modified to communicate through text and visual signals. Yet nothing in the house betrayed his past. No military photos, no commendations, nothing that hinted at the 2 decades he'd spent as an Army Ranger before the IED explosion outside Fallujah had taken his hearing permanently. Thomas moved to his barn, where his fingers danced across the control panel of his custom-modified tractor. He'd redesigned much of his farm equipment himself, adding vibration feedback systems that allowed him to hear the machinery's performance through his fingertips. The adaptations had begun as necessary accommodations, but had evolved into innovations that outperformed standard equipment in many ways. His daily routine never varied. Check the eastern fields at dawn, maintain equipment until mid-morning, then work the western fields until lunch. The discipline remained from his military days, but the rigid schedule also provided security. In a world without sound, predictability helped him maintain control. As Thomas finished inspecting his irrigation system, he felt a familiar vibration against his hip. His specially designed phone alerting him to a message. It was from Eleanor Barnes, who owned the general store in Clearwater and had learned sign language specifically to communicate with him when he first moved to the area. In the 15 years since, she'd become one of the few people he considered a friend. "Strangers in town asking questions about Valley properties," her message read. 3 men, expensive SUV, out-of-state plates, not the usual developers. Something off about them. Be aware. Thomas frowned, tucking the phone away. The valley had seen increased interest from developers recently as the nearby resort town of Bridger Falls expanded. Agricultural land was being converted to vacation properties at an alarming rate. 3 neighboring farms had sold in the past year alone. But Thomas had no intention of selling. This land wasn't just his livelihood, it was his sanctuary, the place where he'd rebuilt his life after losing his hearing. He headed back toward his house, pausing halfway when a different vibration caught his attention. The distinctive tremor of approaching vehicles on his access road. Thomas crouched, placing his palm flat against the soil. 3 vehicles, heavy, moving faster than typical farm visitors. The pattern was unmistakable, deliberate, coordinated, the kind of approach he'd felt countless times during operations in hostile territory. Standing, Thomas moved to the edge of his property, where he could observe the road. Soon, 3 black SUVs appeared, kicking up dust as they approached. Their windows were tinted, obscuring the occupants, but the way they positioned themselves, 1 leading, 2 flanking, suggested military or law enforcement training. This wasn't random. This was calculated. Thomas walked calmly to his front porch and waited. The vehicles pulled up in a semicircle facing his house, a tactical position that provided maximum coverage while establishing psychological dominance. It was a formation he recognized from his own training, designed to intimidate. He remained still, his face impassive, watching. 5 men emerged. The leader wore an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. Shoulders too square, stance too balanced, eyes continuously scanning. The others positioned themselves strategically, hands ready near concealed weapons. Thomas recognized the type immediately. Private security, probably former military, the kind who traded their training for whoever paid the highest price. The leader approached with practiced confidence, flanked by 2 men. As he drew closer, Thomas noted the subtle details, the slight bulge of a shoulder holster, the communication device in his ear, the calculating way his eyes assessed the property. This wasn't just about land acquisition, this was about something more. The man stopped 10 feet away and smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. He held out a business card toward Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood," he called out, his voice lost to Thomas's silence. "I'm Victor Reynolds with Pinnacle Development Group. We're interested in discussing the purchase of your property." Thomas pointed to his ears and shook his head, signing that he was deaf. The flash of realization crossed Reynolds' face quickly, followed by something that looked like satisfaction, as if Thomas's disability was an unexpected advantage in their negotiation. Reynolds turned to his men, saying something that made them laugh. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but 15 years of reading facial expressions and body language told him everything. They were mocking him. The realization didn't anger him, it simply provided information. These men saw his deafness as weakness. They didn't realize it had become his strength. Reynolds pulled out his phone, typing a message, before holding it up for Thomas to read. "We want to buy your farm. Very generous offer. Time-sensitive opportunity." Thomas took out his own phone, typing his response. "Not interested in selling. Family farm. Not for sale." The pleasant mask slipped momentarily from Reynolds' face, revealing something cold and predatory beneath. He typed another message. "Reconsider. Market changing. Neighboring properties are all selling. Isolated out here. Farming dangerous work. Accidents happen." Thomas read the threat with the same calm detachment he'd maintained during countless combat operations. Through the vibrations in the ground, he felt one of the SUVs repositioning, a standard intimidation tactic. While Reynolds waited for his response, Thomas was already cataloging details with the heightened awareness that had become second nature since losing his hearing. 7 men total, all armed based on their stance and the subtle adjustments they made to their jackets. The vehicles were high-end, probably armored. The way they positioned themselves showed professional training. Not street thugs, but organized operators. Two men constantly scanned the perimeter, one maintaining radio contact. Their formation suggested they were accustomed to having their demands met without significant resistance. What they couldn't know was that Thomas had spent 20 years mastering combat operations before losing his hearing, and the past 15 refining his ability to detect threat through vibration. His entire property had been modified not just for agricultural efficiency, but for tactical awareness. The subtle sensors embedded throughout his land weren't just for farming. They formed a sophisticated security system that had been alerting him to their every movement since they turned onto his road. Thomas typed another message. "Need time to consider. Please return tomorrow." Reynolds smiled, the expression calculated and cold. "Of course. We'll return at noon tomorrow. Consider carefully, Mr. Blackwood. Opportunities like this don't come twice." As the SUVs departed, Thomas remained on his porch, watching until they disappeared from view. Only then did he allow himself a momentary smile. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable, isolated, deaf farmer. Instead, they had just threatened a man who had turned his silence into his greatest weapon, who had learned to sense danger through the earth itself, and who had survived situations far more dangerous than anything these men could imagine. Walking back to his house, Thomas began mentally preparing for what would come next. First, a message to Sheriff Laura Hayes, an Army veteran herself, who had helped him navigate the local bureaucracy when he first purchased the farm. Second, a call to his old Army buddy Michael Turner, now working with the FBI's Rural Crimes Division. Third, securing his property using systems that no one, especially not these visitors, would expect. Inside his modified farmhouse, Thomas moved to a hidden panel beside his fireplace. Sliding it open revealed a sophisticated monitoring system displaying feeds from cameras strategically placed around his property. The technology had been installed not out of paranoia, but as an adaptation that compensated for his inability to hear approaching visitors. Over the years, he'd expanded and refined the system until it provided him with comprehensive awareness of everything occurring within a mile of his house. Thomas studied the footage of the men's visit, reading their lips when they faced the cameras. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Reynolds had told his men, "This will be easier than expected. Deaf old farmer, all alone, will have the property by the weekend one way or another." The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity. They had drastically underestimated him because of his disability. In his years as a ranger, Thomas had learned that being underestimated often provided the greatest tactical advantage. These men saw his deafness as vulnerability. They couldn't understand how it had forced him to develop extraordinary awareness of his environment through his other senses. Thomas activated a secure messaging system and sent detailed descriptions of the visitors and their vehicles to Sheriff Hayes. Her response came quickly. "Known associates of Harding Development. Under investigation in 3 states for land fraud and suspected connections to organized crime. Stay vigilant. Deputy can be there in 30 minutes if needed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pieces were falling into place. The recent pressure on local farmers to sell, the rumors of water rights being manipulated, the mysterious accidents at properties that had resisted initial offers. All of it connected to Pinnacle Development, a front for something much darker. Thomas moved to another hidden panel in his bedroom, revealing a sophisticated communication setup linked to a network of former rangers who had stayed connected after their service. These weren't just old war buddies. They were a resource network that had helped each other transition to civilian life. Some had gone into law enforcement, others private security, a few into specialized technical fields. All of them had maintained the bond formed during their service. His message was simple: situation developing at the farm, Pinnacle development making threats, need information and possible assistance. Responses began arriving within minutes. Information about Pinnacle's operations in other rural communities, patterns of intimidation followed by unexplained accidents, connections to money laundering operations using developed properties, links to the Harding family, whose legitimate business interests provided cover for more sinister activities. As night fell across the Montana landscape, Thomas completed his preparations. His years of military service had taught him to prepare for worst-case scenarios while hoping for peaceful resolutions. The vibration sensors throughout his property had been recalibrated to provide more detailed awareness. Remote cameras had been adjusted to cover potential blind spots. Communication lines with local law enforcement had been established with clear triggers for intervention. But Thomas's most powerful defense remained invisible to anyone who might be watching. His adaptation to deafness had given him an almost supernatural sensitivity to vibration. He could detect approaching vehicles miles before they arrived. He could feel the difference between someone walking normally and someone trying to move stealthily. Most importantly, he could sense the distinctive vibration pattern of weapons fire. Not just that shots had been fired, but the type of weapon, the direction, and the approximate distance. As he checked his security feeds one last time before retiring, Thomas reflected on how the explosion that had taken his hearing had also given him something in return. The loss had forced him to develop an awareness of his environment that went beyond what most people could comprehend. In the silence of his world, he had discovered that the earth itself spoke to those who knew how to listen, not with sound, but with vibration that traveled through soil and stone. Tomorrow Reynolds and his men would return, expecting to intimidate a vulnerable deaf farmer into surrendering his land. Instead, they would encounter a man who had transformed his apparent disability into an extraordinary capability, who had learned to turn silence into his greatest strength. The thugs who thought they had found an easy target were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous adversary is the one who has learned to thrive in a world without sound. Thomas moved to his window, looking out at his darkened farm. The night was clear, stars brilliantly visible away from city lights. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of Clearwater. Placing his hand against the window frame, he felt the subtle vibrations of the night, the distant rumble of a freight train passing miles away, the gentle tremor of wind moving through his wheat fields. These sensations, imperceptible to most, had become his connection to the world. Tomorrow would bring conflict, but tonight, in the perfect silence of his farm, Thomas Blackwood was more aware of his surroundings than any hearing person could possibly understand. In this silence, he had found not limitation, but power. And soon, the men who mocked his deafness would discover exactly what that power meant. The first light of dawn found Thomas Blackwood already awake, his morning routine unchanged, despite the looming confrontation. Discipline had been his anchor since his military days, and especially since losing his hearing. While others might have spent the night anxious and sleepless, Thomas knew that maintaining his normal patterns was a tactical advantage, both for his mental preparation and to avoid alerting any potential observers. As he walked his eastern field, the rising sun at his back, Thomas placed his palm against one of the ancient oak trees that marked his property line. Through its roots deep in the Montana soil, he could feel vibrations from nearly a quarter-mile away. It was a technique he'd developed after returning from Iraq, when the silence had been suffocating, until he discovered this new way of connecting with the world. Thomas's adaptation to deafness hadn't happened overnight. The explosion outside, Fallujah, had taken more than his hearing. It had taken his identity as a soldier, his connection to his team, his entire way of experiencing reality. The first year of recovery had been the darkest of his life, struggling with the profound isolation that came with sudden deafness. Standard rehabilitation had focused on teaching him to live with his limitations. It wasn't until he met Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, a neurologist specializing in sensory adaptation, that everything changed. "Your brain wants to understand the world," she had written on her notepad during their first meeting, after standard hearing aids proved ineffective for his severe damage. "It will remap itself to use whatever input it can get. The question isn't what you've lost, it's what you might gain." Under her guidance, Thomas had begun training his body to perceive vibration with extraordinary sensitivity. What started as simple exercises, feeling the difference between vibrations of different frequencies, evolved into an entirely new way of experiencing his environment. Rebecca had introduced him to research on human echolocation, tactile sound systems, and groundbreaking studies on sensory substitution. Thomas smiled at the memory as he continued his inspection. The training had been grueling, requiring the same discipline and focus he'd applied in his military career, but the results had transformed his life. Within 3 years, he could identify different vehicles by their vibration signatures alone. Within 5, he could detect someone approaching his position from 50 yards away by feeling their footsteps through the ground. Now, 15 years later, his sensitivity had become so refined that he could even distinguish between different calibers of gunfire by their unique vibration patterns. Thomas checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. Reynolds and his men wouldn't return until noon, which gave him precious hours to prepare. His phone vibrated against his hip with a message from Michael Turner at the FBI. "Information confirmed. Victor Reynolds is security chief for Harding Development. 3 ongoing investigations. No indictments yet. Suspected of involvement in 2 accidents at properties that refused to sell in Wyoming last year. Proceed with extreme caution." The confirmation hardened Thomas's resolve. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of criminal intimidation before anyone else got hurt. He responded with a simple acknowledgement and request for a call with the local field office later that day. Back at his house, Thomas activated his secure computer system and began reviewing the comprehensive defense plan he'd developed years ago, but hoped never to use. The project had begun as a theoretical exercise. How would he protect his property if his hearing impairment became a factor during an emergency? Over time, it had evolved into a sophisticated security system uniquely adapted to his abilities. The heart of the system was a network of vibration sensors embedded throughout his property, connected to a central monitoring station in his basement. Each sensor was calibrated to detect specific types of movement: human footsteps, vehicles, even the particular resonance of weapons being handled. The information was translated into tactical data displayed on modified screens, and more importantly, through vibration pads that allowed Thomas to feel what was happening anywhere on his farm. Thomas ran a complete diagnostic of the system, confirming that all sensors were operational. Then he moved to a hidden panel in his office bookcase, revealing a safe built into the wall. Inside were not just the conventional items one might expect, important documents, emergency cash, but specialized equipment developed during his collaboration with Dr. Sullivan and engineering contacts from his Ranger days. The first item he removed was a set of specialized boots. Unlike normal footwear, these contained microsensors in the soles that amplified ground vibrations and transmitted them directly to nerve receptors in his feet. When wearing them, Thomas could detect movement from extraordinary distances and with remarkable precision. They had been developed initially as a medical device to help those with hearing impairments navigate urban environments. But Thomas and his former team engineer had modified them for tactical applications. Next came a wrist-mounted device that looked like an ordinary sports watch, but contained sophisticated sensors that translated environmental data into subtle vibration patterns against his skin. It could alert him to sudden movement, temperature changes, and even air pressure fluctuations that might indicate someone moving through his house. Thomas methodically checked each piece of equipment, his movements deliberate and precise. There was no anxiety in his actions, only the focused preparation of someone who had faced danger many times before. His apparent disability had long ago ceased to be a limitation in his mind. Instead, it had become the catalyst for developing capabilities that few could comprehend. At 8:45 a.m., a distinctive vibration pattern alerted Thomas to an approaching vehicle, not the heavy SUVs from yesterday, but the lighter rhythm of Eleanor Barnes's pickup truck. He stepped onto his porch just as she pulled up, her familiar vibration signature as recognizable to him as a voice would be to a hearing person. Eleanor had been one of the first people in Clearwater to learn sign language when Thomas moved to the area. At 62, she ran the general store that had been in her family for 3 generations and served as the unofficial information hub for the entire valley. Her weathered face broke into a concerned smile as she approached, her hands moving in the fluid patterns of ASL. "They came back to town last night," she signed. "Staying at the Mountain View Motel. Asked more questions about you specifically." Thomas nodded, inviting her inside where they could talk privately. In his kitchen, equipped with specialized lighting that alerted him to any sounds a hearing person would notice, Eleanor continued, "Sheriff Hayes has been watching them," her hands explained. "They met with 2 men from out of state last night. One of them has been trying to buy up water rights throughout the valley." Thomas considered this information. Water rights were often more valuable than the land itself in this part of Montana. His property included access to a natural aquifer and 3/4 of a mile of creek frontage, critical resources in an increasingly drought-prone region. "What else did they ask about me?" He signed. Eleanor's expression darkened. "They wanted to know if you lived alone, if you had family in the area, and specifically about your disability, how severe it was, how you managed the farm." The tactical implications were clear. They were gathering intelligence, assessing his vulnerability, preparing for something beyond simple intimidation. Thomas thanked Eleanor for the information and assured her he was taking precautions. After she left, Thomas moved to his basement command center. The space looked like an ordinary root cellar at first glance. Rough concrete walls lined with preserved foods and farm supplies. But behind a false section of storage shelving was a room that revealed the true extent of his preparations. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from cameras concealed around his property. A sophisticated computer system continuously analyzed vibration data from his sensor network. Specialized equipment, some military grade, some of his own design. Ndu stood ready for various contingencies. One wall held a detailed topographical map of his farm and the surrounding 5 miles, with key tactical positions marked. Thomas had created this room not out of paranoia, but from the careful risk assessment that had been ingrained during his military career. Rural isolation, while peaceful, carried inherent vulnerabilities. Law enforcement response times could exceed 30 minutes. Cell service was unreliable during storms, and his hearing impairment, while offset by his extraordinary adaptation, remained a factor in emergency planning. As he studied the surveillance feeds, Thomas reflected on the irony of his situation. Reynolds and his men saw his deafness as a weakness to exploit. They couldn't comprehend how it had forced him to develop a heightened awareness of his environment that few people could match. Where they perceived vulnerability, he had built strength. Where they expected limitation, he had created innovation. At 10:15 a.m., another vehicle approached, the distinctive vibration pattern of Sheriff Laura Hayes's patrol SUV. Thomas met her at the edge of his driveway, away from the house where they could speak privately. Laura Hayes had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to Montana law enforcement. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. She'd learned basic sign language to communicate with Thomas shortly after becoming sheriff 3 years ago. Got background on Reynolds and his associates, she signed, her movements efficient and precise. Former private military contractors, worked for several security firms with questionable reputations. 2 of them have assault charges that were mysteriously dropped. She handed Thomas a file containing photographs and information on each man. They've been involved in land acquisition deals in Wyoming, Idaho, and now Montana. Pattern is always the same: pressure tactics followed by accidents if owners refuse to sell. Thomas reviewed the information, noting tactical details about each man, their likely training, weapons preferences, operational patterns. The file confirmed what he'd suspected. These weren't random thugs, but organized operators with military or law enforcement backgrounds. "What's your plan?" Laura signed, her expression concerned but respectful. She understood enough about Thomas's background to know he was far from helpless. "Talk first," Thomas responded. "Record everything. Let them show their hand." Laura nodded. "I've positioned a deputy on rotation at the crossroads, 5 minutes away. Signal if you need immediate response." She handed him a specialized alert device that would connect directly to police dispatch. "And Thomas, be careful. These men have resources and connections. This isn't just about your farm." After the sheriff departed, Thomas returned to his command center to finalize preparations. The conversation had confirmed his assessment of the broader situation. Reynolds and his employers weren't just after his property. They were systematically acquiring land and water rights throughout the region, using intimidation where money didn't suffice. Thomas activated additional security protocols, including a system that would record all interactions from multiple angles. If Reynolds and his men crossed the line into explicit threats or violence, the evidence would be irrefutable. But Thomas suspected they were too professional for such obvious mistakes. Their approach would be more subtle, pressure that gradually escalated while maintaining plausible deniability. At 11:30 a.m., Thomas received an encrypted message from a former Ranger teammate now working in private security. Reynolds worked South American operations for Blackwater Splinter Group 2012-2015. Specialized in resource acquisition, pressuring local farmers to sell mineral rights. 3 investigations, no charges. Considered highly effective and ruthless. Team with him includes former Army and Marines with specialized training, not amateurs. The information aligned with everything Thomas had gathered. These were trained operators who had successfully intimidated targets in multiple countries. They were accustomed to exploiting perceived weaknesses and facing minimal resistance. Their experience made them dangerous but also predictable. They would follow established playbooks that Thomas had not only studied, but helped develop during his military career. As noon approached, Thomas changed into his sensor-equipped boots and activated his tactical vibration system. Immediately, his awareness of the property expanded dramatically. He could feel the wind moving through his wheat fields, the subtle tremors of small animals moving underground, the distant vibration of traffic on the county road 3 miles away. He moved to his front porch to wait, appearing to any observer as nothing more than a farmer taking a midday break. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral. Nothing in his demeanor betrayed the heightened awareness he maintained of every vibration around him or the strategic preparations he had completed throughout the morning. At precisely 11:58 a.m., Thomas felt the distinctive vibration pattern of heavy SUVs turning onto his access road. This time there were 4 vehicles, not 3, an escalation that confirmed his assessment of their intentions. Through the specialized sensors in his boots, he could feel the weight distribution and engine resonance of each vehicle. 3 were the same as yesterday, but the 4th was heavier, likely armored to a higher specification. Thomas remained seated on his porch swing, projecting the image of a simple farmer unaware of the approaching threat. But through his enhanced perception, he tracked every aspect of their approach, their speed, their formation, the way they positioned themselves as they came into view. Reynolds and his men were implementing standard intimidation protocols, unaware that their target was reading their tactical intentions through vibrations they didn't even know they were creating. The vehicles pulled up in a semicircle facing his house, more aggressive in their positioning than yesterday. 8 men emerged, 3 more than their previous visit. Their body language had shifted from professional to predatory, hands resting near concealed weapons, spacing themselves in standard tactical formation. Victor Reynolds approached the porch, flanked by 2 men whose posture identified them as immediate security rather than just intimidating presence. His smile remained, but his eyes had hardened with purpose. Thomas stood slowly, his movements deliberately those of an older farmer rather than the trained operator he had been. He felt the vibrations of each man's movement through his specialized boots, their weight distribution, their breathing patterns, the subtle tells of adrenal response that indicated their readiness for confrontation. Reynolds held up his phone with a message already typed. "Have you considered our offer, Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas took out his own phone and typed his response. "Yes, still not interested in selling. This farm is not for sale at any price." The subtle shift in Reynolds' stance told Thomas everything he needed to know about what would come next. The vibration of increased heart rates and altered breathing patterns spread through the group of men. Physiological changes imperceptible to most, but clearly felt by Thomas through his enhanced sensitivity. Reynolds was preparing to escalate, unaware that every vibration, every subtle movement, was providing Thomas with tactical information more valuable than anything hearing could have offered. The confrontation was about to move to its next phase, exactly as Thomas had anticipated. What Reynolds couldn't know was that in preparing to intimidate a deaf farmer, he had walked into a situation where his target's apparent disability had become his most significant tactical advantage. Thomas felt the vibration of a weapon being adjusted in a shoulder holster, the subtle shift of weight as one of the men moved to a more aggressive stance. Through the earth itself, he could read their intentions more clearly than if they had spoken them aloud. Reynolds typed another message. "I don't think you understand your situation, Mr. Blackwood. We're not just making an offer. We're telling you how this ends. The only variable is whether you profit from the inevitable." Thomas's expression remained neutral as he read the message, but through his enhanced perception, he felt the men spreading out in a containment pattern around his porch. Standard operating procedure for controlling a situation while maintaining plausible deniability of threat. It was a technique he had not only encountered, but taught during his years as a ranger instructor. The quiet preparation and strategic planning Thomas had implemented throughout the morning was about to be tested. Reynolds and his men thought they were dealing with an isolated, vulnerable deaf farmer who could be easily intimidated. They were about to discover how thoroughly they had underestimated their target and how completely Thomas Blackwood had transformed his silence into an extraordinary tactical advantage. Reynolds stared at Thomas with growing frustration, clearly unaccustomed to having his intimidation tactics dismissed so calmly. The vibrations from his feet told Thomas that the man's heart rate had increased, a physical sign of anger that no facial control could hide from Thomas's enhanced perception. "This is your final opportunity for a peaceful resolution," Reynolds typed, his fingers jabbing at the screen more forcefully than necessary. "By tomorrow, the county will be reviewing concerns about code violations on your property. By next week, your water rights will be challenged in court. This can get very expensive and unpleasant, Mr. Blackwood." Thomas read the message with the same impassive expression he'd maintained throughout their interaction. He typed his response deliberately. "I've lived peacefully here for 15 years. I follow the law, I pay my taxes, I maintain my property. Any legal challenges will fail. Now please leave." The shift in vibration was immediate, not just from Reynolds, but from his entire team. Through the specialized sensors in his boots, Thomas felt the subtle weight transfers that indicated men preparing for potential action. Two of them had moved to positions that would flank him if he stepped off the porch. Another had returned to one of the SUVs, likely retrieving something. Reynolds's smile had vanished completely now. He typed one final message. "We tried the reasonable approach. Remember that when things get difficult." He made a sharp gesture to his men, and they began returning to their vehicles. Thomas remained motionless on his porch, tracking their movements through vibration alone. The man who had gone to the SUV returned with a metal case before getting back into the vehicle. As they prepared to depart, one of them deliberately walked to Thomas's mailbox and removed something from his pocket. Through the vibrations, Thomas recognized the distinctive movement pattern of someone placing an object inside. Only after the last SUV had disappeared down his access road did Thomas approach the mailbox. Inside was a small device, a simple electronic timer attached to nothing. It wasn't a bomb or any actual threat, just a psychological tactic designed to demonstrate vulnerability. "We can access your property anytime. We can place anything we want." The message was clear. Thomas took the device to his workshop, disassembled it methodically, and confirmed it contained no tracking components or surveillance technology. It was purely a psychological tool, meant to provoke fear or rash action. Had he been the simple farmer they believed him to be, it might have worked. Returning to his command center, Thomas reviewed the recordings of the entire interaction. Reynolds and his men had been careful to maintain plausible deniability. No explicit threats were made, no weapons displayed. To any outside observer, it might appear as a tense business negotiation. Nothing more. Their professionalism made them more dangerous, not less. Thomas checked his secure communication system and found multiple messages waiting. The network of former rangers he'd alerted was mobilizing resources, gathering intelligence, and preparing to assist if needed. This wasn't just about loyalty to a former teammate. These men understood that what happened on Thomas's farm could set a precedent for other communities facing similar pressure tactics. The first message came from Jason Miller, who had served as Thomas's communications specialist during 3 deployments and now worked for a cybersecurity firm in Denver. Background check complete on Pinnacle Development. Shell company for Harding International. CEO Alexander Harding linked to multiple federal investigations. Company purchasing water rights across 4 states. Pattern suggests preparation for regional water control during projected drought cycles. This confirmed Thomas's suspicion that his farm was valuable not just for the land, but for its water access. Montana's water rights operated under the prior appropriation doctrine. First in time, first in right, and his property held some of the oldest water rights in the valley, dating back to the original homestead established in 1887. The second message was from Carlos Vasquez, former demolitions expert from Thomas's Ranger unit, who now worked as a security consultant. can arrive tomorrow with equipment and two-man team, specialized surveillance countermeasures and property security systems. Say the word. Thomas considered the offer carefully. Additional manpower would be valuable, but could also escalate the situation prematurely. He responded, "Stand by. Developing situation. Will advise if deployment is needed." The third message came from Rebecca Sullivan, the neurologist who had helped him develop his vibration sensitivity training. "Thomas, got your alert. My research lab has prototype sensory enhancement gear that might help. Next-generation vibration translation systems. I can be there in 2 days if needed." Her offer reminded Thomas of how many connections he'd maintained during his 15 years of apparent isolation. What Reynolds and his team couldn't understand was that Thomas's disability hadn't cut him off from the world. It had forced him to build different, often stronger forms of connection with a network of specialists united by shared experience and purpose. As Thomas considered his response to Rebecca, his system alerted him to an approaching vehicle, the distinctive vibration pattern of Sam Walker's truck. Sam had been among the first people Thomas had met after purchasing the farm, a fourth-generation rancher whose property adjoined Thomas's northern boundary. Sam had initially been skeptical of the city boy playing farmer, but had quickly recognized Thomas's seriousness and work ethic. Thomas met Sam at the front door. At 65, Sam Walker remained remarkably strong, his weathered face testifying to decades working under the Montana sun. Unlike most people who struggled to communicate with Thomas, Sam had approached the challenge pragmatically, using a small whiteboard he carried in his truck and learning basic signs over the years. "Got your message," Sam signed, his movements clumsy but effective. "Reynolds' boys visited 3 ranches last month. Same approach with everyone." Thomas invited him inside, where Sam pulled out his whiteboard to communicate more complex information. "They're damming creek tributaries on properties they've acquired, affecting water flow downstream. County not enforcing regulations. Something bigger is happening." This was valuable intelligence. Water diversion would be devastating for farms throughout the valley, especially with climate models predicting increasingly severe drought cycles. By controlling key water sources, Harding International could effectively control the entire region. Sam wrote more. "5 families meeting tonight at my place. All concerned. Need your help." Thomas raised his eyebrows questioningly. "You've got a military background. We know that much," Sam wrote. "You understand the tactics these guys are using. We need guidance on protecting our properties, our rights." This was an unexpected development. Thomas had maintained a friendly but somewhat distant relationship with his neighbors, his deafness providing a natural buffer that most respected. Now they were reaching out, recognizing that his experience might be crucial to their collective security. Thomas nodded his agreement and signed that he would attend. Sam looked relieved, then wrote one final note. "These men threatened my granddaughter, said they knew her school schedule, the route she takes to riding lessons, crossed a line." The information sent a cold focus through Thomas. Reynolds and his team weren't just applying pressure to property owners. They were threatening families, children. That transformed the situation from a property dispute to something far more serious. After Sam departed, Thomas sent a series of messages to his network, activating resources that he had hoped would not be necessary. To Carlos, "Team and equipment. Approved. Arrive tomorrow. Maintain a low profile." To Rebecca, "Bring prototype system. Will arrange secure accommodation in town." To Michael Turner at the FBI, "Documented threats against minors. Formal investigation justified." The response from Turner came quickly. "Evidence required for formal investigation. Current Bureau priorities limit resources for potential threats without direct action or explicit documentation. Continue gathering information." Thomas understood the bureaucratic constraints. Without clear evidence of criminal activity, federal agencies wouldn't commit resources to what appeared to be a local property dispute. That would change once he had documented Reynolds's operation more thoroughly. At 5:30 p.m., Thomas drove to Sam Walker's ranch for the meeting. As he approached the property, he noted 3 unfamiliar trucks parked in the drive, neighbors gathering. As Sam had indicated, through his specialized boots, he felt the vibration of people moving inside Sam's house, the distinctive patterns of nervous energy and animated conversation. Sam welcomed him at the door and led him to the living room where 5 families had gathered. Thomas recognized most of them. The Millers, who ran the organic dairy operation to the south, the Hendersons, whose apple orchards supplied the regional farmers' markets, the Chens, first-generation owners of a sizable vegetable farm, and the Petersons, whose cattle ranch had been in the family for over a century. The anxiety in the room was palpable, transmitted through the floorboards as subtle vibration patterns that Thomas could interpret as clearly as facial expressions. These were proud, independent people, unaccustomed to asking for help, now facing a threat they didn't know how to counter. Sam had prepared whiteboards for everyone to use in communicating with Thomas, a thoughtful accommodation that Thomas appreciated. The discussion began with each family sharing their experiences with Reynolds and his team. The pattern was consistent: initial offers followed by escalating pressure, implied threats, and mysterious problems on properties that resisted. Margaret Chen wrote, "They damaged our irrigation system last week. Can't prove it was them, but pipes were deliberately cut." James Peterson added, "Our cattle gates were opened overnight. Lost 16 heads before we discovered it. Sheriff investigated but found nothing conclusive." Sarah Henderson's note was more alarming. "They mentioned our daughter by name, asked if she enjoyed teaching at the elementary school. Pure intimidation." Thomas absorbed this information, noting the escalation pattern. Reynolds and his team were following a systematic approach. Start with property damage that could be attributed to accident or vandalism, then progress to more personal intimidation. It was a strategy designed to remain just below the threshold that would trigger serious law enforcement intervention while steadily increasing pressure on holdouts. When everyone had shared their experiences, all eyes turned to Thomas. These families needed more than sympathy. They needed practical guidance from someone who understood the tactics being used against them. Using a combination of sign language that Sam interpreted and his own whiteboard, Thomas outlined his assessment of the situation. "Reynolds runs a professional operation," he explained. "Former military or security contractors with experience in pressure tactics. They exploit isolation and limited law enforcement resources, but their approach has weaknesses." Thomas continued. "First, they rely on intimidation because actual violence creates legal exposure they can't afford. Second, they need to maintain plausible deniability, which limits their actions. Third, they depend on targets being isolated and unable to coordinate resistance." The room grew still as Thomas outlined his recommendations. 1. Document everything: cameras, journals, witnesses. 2. Establish communication network, regular check-ins, emergency alerts. 3. Create mutual support system, no property left unattended, shared security patrols. 4. Build community visibility, local press, social media attention on land. Purchases? When he finished, there was a moment of silence as the families processed his advice. Then David Miller stood up and wrote on his whiteboard, "We should have come together sooner. But it's not too late. I'm in." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Margaret Chen wrote, "My brother was in the army. He'll come stay with us, help with security." James Peterson added, "Got 4 ranch hands ready to participate in community patrols." Thomas watched as something powerful transformed the room. Where there had been isolated fear, a sense of collective resolve now emerged. Reynolds and his team had counted on each family feeling alone and vulnerable. That advantage was now disappearing. Sarah Henderson approached Thomas directly, writing carefully on her board, "We heard rumors about your background. Military, special forces, don't need details, just want to know. Can we win this?" Thomas met her gaze steadily before signing his response, which Sam interpreted, "Reynolds expects scared farmers. Let's show him something different." The meeting continued for another hour as they established concrete plans, communication protocols, security measures, documentation standards. Thomas provided guidance on camera placement, intrusion detection methods, and coordination procedures. By the time they finished, what had begun as a gathering of frightened neighbors had transformed into the foundation of an organized resistance. As the meeting concluded, Sam pulled Thomas aside and handed him a dusty wooden box. Inside was an old lever-action Winchester rifle, well-maintained despite its age. "Belonged to my grandfather," Sam wrote. "Still works perfectly. Know you probably have your own equipment, but thought you might appreciate the sentiment. This valley looks after its own." The gesture moved Thomas more than he had expected. For 15 years he had maintained a careful distance from his neighbors, his deafness providing a natural barrier. Now that barrier was transforming into a different kind of connection, one based on mutual respect and common purpose. Driving back to his farm under the vast Montana sky, Thomas reflected on the changing situation. Reynolds and his team had made a critical miscalculation. They had evaluated each property owner individually, assessing vulnerabilities and pressure points. What they hadn't counted on was these independent, prideful ranchers and farmers coming together, sharing information and organizing resistance. As Thomas turned onto his access road, his specialized boots picked up an unfamiliar vibration pattern. A vehicle parked on the Forest Service road that ran along his western boundary. Someone was watching his property, probably documenting his movements and visitors. Reynolds was establishing surveillance, gathering intelligence for the next phase of pressure. Rather than react directly, Thomas continued to his house normally, maintaining the appearance of obliviousness. Once inside, he activated his counter-surveillance system, which detected 2 observation positions, one on the western boundary and another near his northern access point. The positioning was professional, designed to monitor approaches to his property while remaining concealed. Thomas sent encrypted updates to his arriving support team, advising them of the surveillance positions and recommending alternate approach routes. To Carlos, "Surveillance in place. Use Forest Service maintenance roads for access. We'll meet at coordinates attached." To Rebecca, "Observer teams monitoring farm. We'll arrange a secure pickup from the airport." The presence of surveillance teams confirmed that Reynolds was escalating according to predicted patterns. First came the offers, then the threats, now the intelligence gathering. Next would come demonstrations of vulnerability, minor property damage, unexplained equipment failures, incidents that appeared accidental but carried clear messages. Thomas moved to his command center and initiated a secure video call with Jason Miller in Denver, who had been analyzing Harding International's corporate structure and land acquisition patterns. Jason's hands moved rapidly in sign language on the screen. Found the connection. Harding established a water control company last year. Patent applications for new water purification and distribution systems. They're positioning for water scarcity, climate change impacts. Your valley is strategic acquisition, natural aquifer, minimal regulatory oversight. This confirmed Thomas's hypothesis about the broader strategy. Alexander Harding wasn't just buying land, he was preparing for a future where water access would become increasingly valuable and contested. By controlling key watersheds across multiple states, Harding could establish a private water empire, leveraging scarcity for profit. Thomas responded, "Local alliance established. Support teams arriving tomorrow need digital security protocols. For community networks, Jason nodded, signaling his understanding of the request. As one of the country's top cybersecurity experts, he could help establish secure communications for the valley's residents that would be resistant to surveillance or interference. After ending the call, Thomas performed a final security check. Before retiring for the night, his perimeter sensors showed no active threats, though the surveillance teams remained in position. Tomorrow would bring new developments as his support network arrived and the community's mutual defense plan was implemented. As he prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on Reynolds's fundamental miscalculation. In targeting a deaf farmer living alone, Reynolds thought he had found an isolated, vulnerable victim. Instead, he had challenged someone whose disability had forced him to build extraordinary adaptations and whose military background had provided him with both tactical expertise and a powerful network of allies. More importantly, Reynolds didn't understand the community he was attempting to intimidate. These Montana families might have their differences, might even keep their distance from one another under normal circumstances, but generations of surviving harsh winters and challenging conditions had created a resilience that corporate tacticians from distant cities couldn't comprehend. Through his bedroom window, Thomas looked out at the star-filled Montana sky. Placing his hand against the window frame, he felt the subtle vibrations of the night, a coyote pack moving along the creek bed, the distant rumble of a freight train passing 10 miles away, the gentle sway of his wheat fields in the evening. Breeze. Tomorrow would bring conflict, but tonight Thomas took comfort in these sensations that connected him to his land and, increasingly, to the community that called this valley home. Reynolds and his team had made a critical error. They saw his deafness as weakness, his apparent isolation as vulnerability. They couldn't understand that sometimes silence becomes its own kind of strength, and that communities, like individuals, reveal their true character not in times of peace, but in moments of challenge. The alliance Thomas had helped forge today was just the beginning. Reynolds wanted the valley's land and water. Instead, he was about to receive an education in the true meaning of community resistance. Dawn broke over Thomas Blackwood's farm with unusual activity. Through his vibration-sensing boots, Thomas felt the distinctive patterns of vehicles approaching from the east. Not the heavy SUVs of Reynolds' team, but the lighter signatures of Sheriff Hayes' patrol vehicle and a cargo van he didn't recognize. Standing on his porch, he watched as they approached, the morning sun glinting off their windshields. Laura Hayes stepped out first, followed by a man whose movement patterns Thomas immediately recognized, despite 15 years of separation. Marcus. Reed had been Thomas's intelligence specialist during 3 deployments, his ability to gather and analyze information unmatched within their Ranger unit. Now he ran a private security consulting firm that specialized in rural property protection, a perfect cover for his arrival. Behind them came a nondescript cargo van driven by Carlos Vasquez, whose vibration signature Thomas would have recognized anywhere. Carlos had been their demolitions and perimeter security expert, with an uncanny talent for designing defensive systems that remained invisible until triggered. The skills that had made him invaluable in combat zones now served a different purpose as he developed security solutions for properties facing threats of all kinds. Sheriff Hayes approached first, her hands moving in the efficient sign language she'd learned for communicating with Thomas. 2 more families reported threats this morning. Reynolds is escalating faster than expected. Thomas nodded his understanding, then turned to greet his former teammates. No words were necessary as they embraced. These were men who had once communicated entire tactical plans through hand signals in environments where sound meant death. Marcus's hands moved in the abbreviated combat signs they had developed years ago. Surveillance team rotated at 0600. New team is less professional, sloppier positioning. Thomas led them into his house, where they could speak more freely. Once, inside, Marcus unpacked a case of electronic equipment designed to detect and neutralize surveillance devices. "Standard protocol for Reynolds' operation," he explained, his signs crisp and efficient. "They'll be trying to gather leverage, conversations, contacts, vulnerabilities." Carlos was already moving through the house with a scanner, his experienced eyes checking entry points and security measures. He signed his approval of Thomas's preparations before adding, "Brought specialized equipment, perimeter enhancement systems, counter-surveillance packages, need installation time." Sheriff Hayes watched this interaction with professional interest. Before signing, Reynolds met with County Commissioner Wilson last night. Private dinner, Wilson oversees water rights arbitration and building code enforcement. This was significant intelligence. If Reynolds had compromised local officials, legal channels for resistance would be limited. Thomas signed his thanks for the information, then outlined the community network established at yesterday's meeting. Laura nodded her approval. "I'll coordinate patrol schedules to supplement community watches," she signed. "But you should know, my department has limitations. County oversight, jurisdictional boundaries, resource constraints." Thomas understood the subtext. She would help where she could, but her official capacity was restricted by political realities. The resistance would need to rely primarily on private resources and community action. As they finished discussing immediate security arrangements, Thomas's vibration alert system signaled another approaching vehicle, the distinctive pattern of Eleanor Barnes's pickup. Thomas met her at the door, immediately noting her agitated state through the intensity of her movements. "Trouble at the Chen farm," she signed rapidly. "Water supply was contaminated overnight. Irrigation system damaged. Margaret's brother confronted. Men on the property. They claimed to be county water inspectors, but had no identification." This represented a significant escalation. Reynolds was moving from intimidation to direct action against those who'd attended yesterday's meeting. The timing wasn't coincidental. He was sending a message to the newly formed alliance. Thomas signed instructions to Sheriff Hayes, who immediately departed for the Chen property. To Carlos, he indicated specific security priorities, and to Marcus, he requested expanded surveillance coverage. His former teammates moved with practiced efficiency, understanding the tactical situation without requiring detailed explanation. Eleanor watched this coordination with evident surprise. Like most residents of Whitewater Valley, she had known pieces of Thomas's background but had never seen this side of him. The command presence, the tactical awareness, the natural leadership that his ranger career had instilled. "Reynolds has 4 teams operating in the valley now," she signed after Sheriff Hayes departed. 2 monitoring properties, 1 approaching owners with new offers, 1 implementing what they call demonstrations. Property damage, equipment failures. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this development. Reynolds was following a standard escalation protocol: increase pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelm resistance with coordinated action, create the impression of inevitable defeat. It was a tactic designed to break the will of opponents before direct confrontation became necessary. Eleanor had more information. "They've been asking specific questions about you, not just your deafness, but whether you have visitors, how you respond to unexpected situations. They're planning something for your property." This intelligence confirmed Thomas's assessment. Reynolds had identified him as the axis of resistance and would prioritize breaking him to demoralize the others. The strategy was predictable: target the perceived leader, demonstrate their vulnerability, and watch the coalition fracture from loss of confidence. Thomas thanked Eleanor for the warning, then walked her to her truck. As she departed, his vibration sensors detected activity at the far edge of his property. the distinctive patterns of multiple individuals moving on foot through his western wheat field, attempting to maintain stealth. Through his command center monitors, Thomas identified 3 men in County Water Department uniforms carrying equipment toward his irrigation pump house. Their movement patterns betrayed their deception. These weren't utility workers, but operatives placing something near his critical infrastructure. Thomas activated his property's enhanced surveillance system, capturing high-resolution video of the intrusion. The men planted several devices at his main water pump, then retreated using the cover of his wheat fields. Their efficiency suggested military or law enforcement background, more of Reynolds' professional team implementing the next phase of pressure. Rather than immediately investigate, Thomas waited until they had departed before sending Carlos to examine the devices with proper precautions. 20 minutes later, Carlos returned with 3 sophisticated components clearly designed to mimic equipment failure. One would have contaminated his water supply with a non-toxic but foul-smelling chemical. Another would have caused his irrigation system to malfunction, potentially killing acres of crops before detection. The third was a simple tracking device to monitor his response to the sabotage. Carlos's hands moved in practiced signs. Professional equipment, military-grade components, not amateur intimidation. This is an organized operation with significant resources. Thomas nodded, having expected as much. Reynolds wasn't just employing thugs. He was directing a sophisticated campaign with trained personnel and specialized equipment. This operation had likely been refined through multiple implementations in other rural communities, optimized for maximum pressure while maintaining legal deniability. By noon, Thomas's farm had transformed into an operations center. Marcus had established enhanced surveillance coverage of the property and surrounding areas. Carlos had implemented the first phase of security enhancements, focused on critical infrastructure and approach routes, and a secure communications network now connected the allied properties throughout the valley, allowing real-time sharing of threat information. Thomas's vibration alert system signaled an approaching helicopter, the distinctive pattern unmistakable through his enhanced perception. He stepped outside as the aircraft appeared over the eastern ridge, a sleek private model that settled onto his dedicated landing area with practiced precision. Dr. Rebecca Sullivan emerged, followed by 2 assistants carrying specialized equipment, cases. At 48, Rebecca remained the brilliant neurologist whose pioneering work on sensory adaptation had helped Thomas transform his deafness into an extraordinary capability. Her research now focused on advanced applications of sensory substitution technology, developing systems that could translate one form of sensory information into another. Thomas greeted her with the warmth reserved for someone who had fundamentally changed his life. Rebecca's hands moved in the fluid signs they had developed during years of collaboration, brought next-generation prototypes. Significant advances in vibration translation systems could be crucial for what you're facing. Inside his workshop, Rebecca unpacked equipment that represented the cutting edge of sensory adaptation technology. The centerpiece was an advanced version of Thomas's vibration sensing system, a comprehensive network of sensors that could be deployed throughout a property to detect and identify specific vibration patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Neural processing algorithms have advanced significantly, Rebecca explained as her assistant set up demonstration components. This system can distinguish between hundreds of distinct vibration signatures, different weapons, vehicles, even individual walking patterns. It creates a comprehensive awareness field with classification capabilities beyond anything currently available. Thomas recognized the potential immediately. His existing system already gave him extraordinary awareness of his environment, but This advanced version would provide tactical intelligence that even conventional security systems couldn't match. It could identify specific threats, track multiple individuals simultaneously, and distinguish between routine activity and potential danger. As Rebecca's team began installing components, Thomas received an urgent message from David Miller at the organic dairy operation. Reynolds' team just left, escalated threats, said examples would be made tonight of those who refused to cooperate, mentioned you specifically. Similar messages arrived from other Alliance members within the hour. Reynolds was making his move, announcing demonstrations of power that would convince holdouts of the futility of resistance. The pattern was consistent with operations he had run in other regions, creating examples through carefully orchestrated incidents that caused significant damage while maintaining plausible deniability. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had gathered his team in the command center to assess the developing situation. Sheriff Hayes had returned from the Chen farm, bringing photographs of the damage. Clearly deliberate sabotage disguised as equipment failure. Marcus had compiled intelligence from multiple sources, creating a comprehensive picture of Reynolds' operation throughout the valley. Carlos had completed the first phase of security enhancements, focusing on critical vulnerabilities. They have 4 primary teams operating, Marcus signed, indicating positions on a digital map of the valley. Alpha team conducting surveillance and intelligence gathering. Bravo team implementing pressure tactics, property damage, intimidation. Charlie team handling negotiation and acquisition. Delta team providing security and specialized operations. Carlos added his assessment. Delta team includes former military personnel with specialized training. Equipment suggests paramilitary capability with corporate funding. Not typical security contractors. These are specialized operators. Sheriff Hayes confirmed this analysis. Background checks identify at least 3 with special operations experience, 2 former law enforcement with tactical training, all working under private security licenses tied to shell companies. Rebecca's contribution was equally valuable. Psychological profile of operation suggests hierarchical command structure. Reynolds implements but doesn't design strategy, working for someone with both tactical and strategic expertise. Thomas absorbed this information, analyzing patterns and vulnerabilities. Reynolds' operation was impressive in scope and execution, well-funded, professionally staffed, and methodically implemented. But its very sophistication created specific weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood its fundamental design. Through his vibration sensing system, Thomas felt the distinctive pattern of an approaching vehicle, the heavy signature of one of Reynolds' SUVs moving slowly along the county road that bordered his eastern property line. It stopped at the observation point established yesterday, maintaining surveillance while staying outside his property boundaries. This was standard procedure before a planned operation. Establish observation, confirm target patterns, verify absence of unexpected factors. Reynolds was preparing for tonight's demonstration, unaware that his every move was being detected and analyzed. By late afternoon, Thomas had coordinated response plans with each allied property. Enhanced security measures had been implemented at critical locations. Communication protocols had been established for real-time reporting of suspicious activity, and Sheriff Hayes had positioned deputies at strategic points throughout the valley, ready to respond to any direct threats. At 5:30 p.m., Thomas received an unexpected message from Michael Turner at the FBI. Regional Office reviewing evidence. From Valley Incidents, initial assessment suggests organized criminal conspiracy. Formal investigation pending authorization. Continued documentation. This represented a significant shift. The federal authorities were finally taking notice of the pattern developing in Whitewater Valley. It wouldn't bring immediate intervention, but it created the potential for eventual Legal consequences for Reynolds and his operation. As sunset approached, Thomas gathered his core team for final preparations. The vibration sensors deployed throughout his property detected no immediate threat, but the surveillance team remained in position, likely coordinating the night's planned activities. They'll target multiple properties simultaneously. Marcus. Signed, outlining his assessment. Standard tactics, overwhelm response capability, create impression of vulnerability, demonstrate futility of resistance. Carlos added, priority targets likely those perceived as leadership. Your farm, the Miller Dairy, Peterson Ranch. Visible damage to demoralize alliance. Sheriff Hayes confirmed her limitations. 3 deputies available tonight. Response time minimum 8 minutes to most properties. Can't maintain presence at all locations. Rebecca's contribution focused on Thomas's specific situation. New vibration system fully operational. Neural interface calibrated to your sensitivity. And parameters, detection range extended to property boundaries. With full darkness settling over the valley, Thomas activated the enhanced security protocols. Through his specialized boots and Rebecca's advanced system, his awareness of the property expanded dramatically. He could feel the subtle movements of nocturnal animals, the gentle sway of wheat stalks in the evening breeze, the distant vibrations of vehicles on the county road 5 miles away. At precisely 9:45 p.m., Thomas felt the distinctive vibration pattern of multiple vehicles turning off their engines at various points around the valley perimeter. Through the community alert network, reports began arriving of dark-clothed figures. Moving across outlying fields toward Alliance properties, Reynolds had launched his coordinated operation. Teams were approaching multiple properties simultaneously, likely carrying equipment for the demonstrations he had promised. The pattern matched Marcus's prediction. Simultaneous actions to overwhelm response capability and create the impression of indefensible vulnerability. Through his command center monitors, Thomas tracked the developing situation. The Peterson Ranch reported figures approaching their main barn. The Miller Dairy detected movement near their processing facility. The Henderson Orchard observed lights moving through their northern fields. But the main thrust, as expected, targeted Thomas's farm. Through his enhanced vibration system, he detected 6 individuals approaching from different directions, their movement patterns indicating professional training. Weight distributed precisely to minimize sound, pacing calibrated for optimal. Stealth, spacing maintained for tactical coverage. Sheriff Hayes dispatched her limited deputies to the most vulnerable properties, knowing she couldn't cover all locations. The community response teams activated their security protocols, implementing the defensive measures Thomas had helped design. In his command center, Thomas monitored the comprehensive tactical display. Reynolds' operation was impressive in its coordination and professionalism. 6 trained operators were converging on his farm with evident skill, their approach calibrated to avoid detection by conventional security measures. What they couldn't know was that Thomas's adaptation to deafness had created defensive capabilities unlike anything they had encountered. Through vibration alone, he tracked their every movement, identifying individual operators by their unique patterns, monitoring their equipment through subtle frequency variations, even detecting their increasing heart rates as they approached. Their objectives. Thomas remained seated calmly in his command center, feeling the vibrations of Reynolds' team moving across his property. They believed they were executing a perfectly coordinated infiltration against a deaf farmer who couldn't possibly detect their approach. They had no way of understanding that they were being monitored with precision that exceeded anything their tactical training had prepared them for. The night's events would demonstrate the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Reynolds' operation. He had seen Thomas's deafness as vulnerability to be exploited. Instead, it had become the foundation of unprecedented defensive capabilities that were about to transform the calculated demonstration into something very different than Reynolds had planned. Through the earth itself, Thomas felt the approaching operators pause at predetermined positions around his property. They were preparing to implement the coordinated demonstration that Reynolds believed would break the Alliance's resistance. Instead, they were about to discover what happens when perceived disability becomes an extraordinary advantage, and when a community decides that intimidation will no longer be tolerated in their valley. As Reynolds's team moved into final position, Thomas activated the specialized systems he had prepared. The confrontation that would define the valley's future was about to begin, and Thomas Blackwood, the deaf farmer who could feel the vibration of gunfire before anyone else could hear, it was ready to reveal just how completely Reynolds had underestimated his opponent. The 6 operators from Reynolds's team moved with practiced stealth through Thomas Blackwood's wheat fields, their dark clothing blending with the night shadows. They believed their approach was undetectable. No flashlights, communication limited to hand signals, movement patterns designed to minimize sound. Each carried specialized equipment for their assigned tasks. 2 with incendiary devices designed to look like electrical malfunctions, 3 with sabotage tools for irrigation and farming equipment, 1 with surveillance gear to document the aftermath. What they couldn't comprehend was that Thomas had been tracking their progress since they exited their vehicles half a mile away. Through his enhanced vibration system, he felt each footstep, each shift in weight, even the subtle tremors of their equipment as they moved. The advanced neural processing algorithms in Rebecca's system translated these vibrations into tactical intelligence more precise than visual observation could provide. In his command center, Thomas watched the tactical display with Carlos and Marcus beside him. The 3 former Rangers communicated through the abbreviated hand signals they had developed during covert operations years ago, a language more efficient than speech for those trained to use it. Sheriff Hayes monitored the situation from her position, coordinating valley-wide response, while Rebecca fine-tuned the vibration system's sensitivity parameters. Teams at positions 3 and 4 reaching deployment points, Marcus signed, indicating locations on the tactical display. Carrying incendiary packages based on vibration signature, Carlos confirmed this assessment. Standard pattern. Create fire that appears electrical in origin. Insurance investigation finds faulty wiring. Owner suffers significant loss while maintaining plausible deniability for perpetrators. Thomas nodded, having anticipated this approach. Reynolds needed to create highly visible damage to demonstrate consequences of resistance while avoiding clear evidence of criminal activity. Fire provided both, devastating impact with built-in excuse for the absence of surveillance footage or witnesses. Through his vibration-sensing boots, Thomas felt the operators pause at precisely the positions he had predicted. They were professionals, following a tactical plan optimized through previous operations. Their positioning reflected standard protocols for property sabotage: maximum damage, minimum exposure, optimal escape routes. What they couldn't know was that Thomas had spent 15 years not just adapting to deafness, but transforming it into the foundation of unprecedented defensive awareness. His entire property had been modified to enhance vibration signatures in ways invisible to conventional observation. The very ground they moved across had become an extension of his sensory perception. At precisely 10:17 p.m., Thomas felt the distinctive vibration pattern of the first operator beginning the sabotage sequence, tools being removed from specialized cases, equipment being positioned against the barn's exterior wall. This was the moment Thomas had been waiting for, when Reynolds' team committed to action that crossed the line from intimidation to criminal damage. With a simple nod to Carlos, Thomas activated the first phase of his response. Throughout the property, specialized lighting systems engaged. Not the expected security floodlights that operators would be prepared to neutralize, but a comprehensive array designed by Rebecca that exploited neurological responses to specific light patterns. The effect was immediate and disorienting. The operator's night vision was instantly compromised by lights that pulsed at frequencies calibrated to disrupt visual processing without causing permanent harm. What would appear to observers as simple security lighting created intense disorientation for those caught in its field of effect. Through his vibration system, Thomas felt the operator's immediate physiological response. Increased heart rates, disrupted balance, confused movement patterns. What they experienced as a devastating assault on their visual systems registered to Thomas only as data on his tactical display and subtle changes in vibration signatures. As the operators struggled to maintain tactical cohesion, Thomas implemented the second phase of his response. Throughout the property, specialized acoustic devices activated, another system designed by Rebecca that operated above and below normal hearing ranges. For Thomas, these frequencies were imperceptible. For Reynolds operators, they created additional neurological disruption that compounded their disorientation. Subject physiological responses indicate severe disorientation, Rebecca signed from her monitoring station. Neural adaptation is impossible within the operational timeframe, effectiveness exceeding predicted parameters. Marcus's assessment was equally precise. Complete tactical breakdown, team communication compromised, no coordinated response possible under these conditions. Thomas watched through his command center's monitors as Reynolds' professional operation dissolved into confusion. Operators who had moved with precision now staggered, disoriented, unable to maintain tactical positioning or implement their sabotage plan. The very training that made them effective under normal conditions became a liability as their bodies responded to neurological disruption they couldn't identify or counter. Through his vibration system, Thomas tracked their desperate attempts to regroup. 2 operators had abandoned their equipment and were attempting to retreat toward their vehicles. 3 others had clustered together, trying to establish defensive positioning while they recovered. The 6th, evidently the team leader, was attempting to implement emergency extraction protocols. Thomas activated the property's documentation systems, capturing comprehensive evidence of the operator's equipment and activities. High-resolution video, vibration signatures, thermal imaging, all recorded and transmitted to secure servers maintained by Marcus's security firm. This evidence would prove crucial for the legal proceedings that would follow. Sheriff Hayes's voice came through the command center's communication system, similar response at Peterson Ranch and Miller Dairy. Operators neutralized without confrontation or injury. Evidence secured by deputies, formal charges being prepared. This valley-wide coordination represented the most significant defeat Reynolds' operation had ever encountered. Previous targets had been isolated, vulnerable, unable to implement comprehensive defensive measures. The Whitewater Valley Alliance had transformed individual weakness into collective strength. Through his vibration system, Thomas felt a new pattern approaching. The distinctive signature of Victor Reynolds himself, arriving in his command SUV. The vehicle stopped at the property boundary, maintaining legal distance while Reynolds observed his operations collapse. His arrival confirmed Thomas's assessment of the man's tactical approach, maintaining personal deniability while directing operations from a safe distance. Thomas nodded to Carlos, who activated the next phase of their response. Throughout the property, concealed speakers engaged, broadcasting a message in Reynolds' direction. All operators documented with military-grade surveillance, evidence transmitted to federal authorities. Depart immediately or face arrest for criminal trespass and attempted property damage. Through specially designed directional speakers, this message was audible only to Reynolds' position, creating the impression of surveillance capabilities far beyond what conventional security systems could provide. It was a calculated, psychological operation designed to undermine Reynolds' confidence in his tactical assessment. The effect was immediate. Through his vibration system, Thomas felt Reynolds' vehicle rapidly accelerate away from the observation point, abandoning his operators to whatever consequences awaited them. This reaction confirmed another element of Reynolds' psychological profile: willingness to sacrifice subordinates to protect himself from direct exposure. With Reynolds retreating, Thomas implemented the final phase of his response to the operators still on his property. Sheriff Hayes's deputies approached from pre-positioned locations, using Thomas's vibration data to locate each disoriented operator. Within 15 minutes, all 6 had been taken into custody without resistance, their specialized sabotage equipment documented and secured as evidence. By 11:30 p.m., Thomas's farm had returned to its normal quiet state, though the tactical implications of the night's events would resonate far beyond Whitewater Valley. In his command center, Thomas, Marcus, Carlos, Rebecca, and Sheriff Hayes assessed the comprehensive defeat of Reynolds' operation. 6 operators in custody at your property, Sheriff Hayes signed. 4 at Peterson Ranch, 5 at Miller Dairy, all with documented evidence of attempted sabotage. Charges being processed for criminal trespass, attempted property damage, conspiracy. Marcus added tactical analysis. Reynolds abandoned observation position. Communications intercepted indicate full withdrawal of remaining surveillance teams. Pattern suggests operational collapse rather than tactical repositioning. Carlos's assessment focused on material evidence. Equipment recovered includes specialized incendiary devices, sabotage tools, surveillance gear, military-grade components with serial numbers, traceable supply chain. Rebecca monitored the physiological data from the operators during their encounter with her specialized systems. No permanent effects from neurological disruption technologies. Temporary disorientation fully reversible. Medical documentation confirms the absence of harmful impact. This last point was particularly important to Thomas. His defensive systems had been carefully designed to neutralize threats without causing lasting harm. Even facing those who intended significant damage to his property, he had maintained the ethical principles that had guided his military service and civilian life. Thomas's vibration system detected a new approach, the distinctive pattern of multiple vehicles moving up his access road. Through his monitors, he identified Sheriff Hayes's department vehicles transporting county officials who had been summoned to document the night's events. Among them was County Commissioner Wilson, whose earlier meeting with Reynolds had suggested potential corruption. Through his vibration sensing, Thomas detected Wilson's physiological response as he observed the comprehensive evidence being processed. Elevated heart rate, disrupted breathing pattern, subtle shifts in posture that indicated extreme anxiety. Faced with irrefutable documentation of criminal activity he had potentially facilitated, Wilson's body betrayed his complicity more clearly than any confession could have. Sheriff Hayes approached Wilson directly, her professional demeanor masking the satisfaction Thomas could detect in her vibration pattern. The conversation that followed, captured by Thomas's surveillance systems, documented Wilson acknowledging awareness of Reynolds' operation and agreeing to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration in his own case. By midnight, Thomas's farm had become the center of a multi-agency investigation. FBI agents had arrived from the regional office, drawn by the scale and sophistication of the evidence gathered. State police investigators were processing the specialized equipment recovered from Reynolds' operators. County officials were documenting property boundaries and attempting to distance themselves from Wilson's apparent corruption. In his workshop, away from the official activity, Thomas debriefed with his core team. The night's events had demonstrated the effectiveness of their preparations, but all recognized that Reynolds and his employers wouldn't accept defeat without escalation. "Harding will respond with legal counterattack," Marcus signed, outlining the expected reaction. Corporate attorneys challenging evidence, political pressure on local officials, media narrative painting property owners as paranoid aggressors. Carlos added his assessment. Secondary response will target alliance members through indirect means, financial pressure, regulatory harassment, supply chain disruption. Rebecca's contribution focused on broader implications. Tonight's defensive success creates a template for other communities facing similar pressure. Documentation protocols are particularly valuable for establishing patterns across multiple jurisdictions. Thomas absorbed these perspectives, considering both immediate priorities and long-term strategy. The night's events had demonstrated the effectiveness of their defensive preparations, but the conflict was far from resolved. Alexander Harding commanded resources far beyond what had been deployed so far, and his strategic objective, control of the valley's water resources, remained unchanged. As the official investigation continued around the property, Thomas received an encrypted message from Jason Miller. Facial recognition matched two operators to a private security firm directly contracted by Harding International. Corporate link established. Federal investigation expanding to include organized criminal conspiracy across state lines. This development transformed the legal dynamics. What had begun as seemingly isolated incidents of property intimidation now qualified for federal prosecution under RICO statutes. The careful documentation gathered throughout Whitewater Valley provided the pattern evidence necessary for authorities to target not just Reynolds and his operators, but potentially the corporate structure that directed them. By 2 a.m., the immediate crisis had passed. Sheriff Hayes's deputies had transported the apprehended operators to county facilities. Federal agents had secured the evidence for national database analysis. The property was quiet again, though enhanced security remained active throughout. The Alliance's farms and ranches. In the pre-dawn hours, Thomas walked his eastern field alone, his vibration-sensing boots connecting him to the subtle rhythms of his land. The night's confrontation had demonstrated something powerful, not just about his own capabilities, but about community resilience in the face of organized intimidation. Through his specialized perception, Thomas felt the vibrations of the awakening day, the subtle movement of groundwater through underground aquifers, the gentle tremors of wind through wheat stalks, the distant rhythm of machinery at the Peterson Ranch already beginning morning operations. These sensations, imperceptible to conventional awareness, had become his connection to the world after losing his hearing. As sunrise approached, Thomas received messages from throughout the Valley Alliance. Each reported the same outcome: Reynolds operators apprehended, evidence secured, properties undamaged. What had been planned as a devastating demonstration of vulnerability had become instead a powerful testament to collective strength. At 6:30 a.m., Thomas felt the vibration of approaching vehicles, not the threatening rumble of Reynolds' SUVs, but the familiar patterns of community members gathering to assess the night's events. Sam Walker's truck led the informal convoy, followed by vehicles from each of the allied families. They gathered in Thomas's front yard, their faces showing the complex emotions of people who had faced a significant threat and emerged stronger than before. Through their body language and the vibrations of their movement, Thomas could read their shifting perspectives more clearly than spoken words could have conveyed. Sam approached with his whiteboard, writing a message that represented the community's collective realization. We've been isolated for too long. Thought independence meant facing everything alone. Last night proved what happens when we stand together. Margaret Chen added her own note. My brother says the systems you created could protect communities across the country facing similar pressure. This isn't just about our valley anymore. James Peterson's message was more personal. 15 years you've been here. Though your deafness meant you needed to be left alone, never understood it was giving you something the rest of us couldn't perceive. These reflections represented a fundamental shift in how the community viewed both Thomas and itself. What had begun as a crisis response to external threat had evolved into something more profound, a recognition of interdependence and the strength that comes from embracing differences rather than merely accommodating them. As Thomas engaged with his neighbors, his vibration system detected a new approach, the distinctive pattern of multiple news vehicles turning onto the county road leading to his farm. Word of the night's events had spread beyond Whitewater Valley, drawing media attention that would further complicate Reynolds's operation. Marcus approached, signaling the tactical implications. Media coverage creates both opportunity and vulnerability. Public awareness protects against escalation, but attracts additional attention from Harding's organization. Thomas nodded his understanding. The conflict was entering a new phase, one that would be fought not just through direct confrontation, but through legal challenges, media narratives, and political influence. The Alliance had won the first significant battle, but the broader struggle for the Valley's future remained unresolved. Sheriff Hayes arrived as the first reporters reached the property boundary. Her presence established official parameters for media engagement, ensuring the investigation wouldn't be compromised by premature disclosures. Her management of the situation reflected her understanding of both legal requirements and strategic communication. As the morning progressed, Thomas received an encrypted message from Michael Turner at the FBI. Federal investigation formally authorized. Harding International Operations under review across multiple states. Your Valley documentation provides critical pattern evidence. Agents arriving tomorrow for comprehensive interviews. This development represented significant progress. Federal resources would complement local efforts, creating legal exposure that even Harding's considerable influence might not be able to neutralize. The careful documentation gathered throughout the Valley had transformed isolated incidents into compelling evidence of organized criminal conspiracy. By mid-morning, Thomas's farm had become the focal point of regional attention. News helicopters circled overhead, their vibrations distinct from the military aircraft Thomas had once tracked in combat zones. Local officials arrived to assess the situation and position themselves favorably in the emerging narrative. Community members gathered to share information and coordinate ongoing security measures. Through it all, Thomas maintained the calm focus that had defined his response from the beginning. What Reynolds and his team had never understood, what they couldn't comprehend from their perspective of conventional tactical thinking, was that Thomas's deafness hadn't isolated him from the world. It had connected him to it in ways they couldn't imagine. The vibrations that Thomas felt through specialized boots, the neural translations of Rebecca's advanced systems, the tactical awareness that didn't depend on auditory input, these weren't compensations for disability, but transformations of perception that created capabilities beyond normal experience. As Thomas watched his community gathering strength from the night's successful defense, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The explosion in Iraq that took his hearing had seemed at first like the end of everything he valued. His military career, his connection to teammates, his way of experiencing the world. Instead, it had become the beginning of something extraordinary. Not just personal adaptation, but the development of capabilities that now protected an entire community. Reynolds had seen Thomas's deafness as a vulnerability to exploit. Instead, it had become the foundation of a defense system that Reynolds couldn't comprehend or counter. In targeting someone he perceived as isolated and handicapped, Reynolds had instead challenged a man who had transformed apparent limitation into unprecedented strength, and in doing so had helped an entire community discover its own capacity for resilience and collective action. The vibrations of the gathering community told Thomas more than words could have expressed. Through the earth itself, he felt the subtle shifts in how these independent, prideful farmers and ranchers moved now, not as isolated individuals, but as connected members of something larger than themselves. What had begun as crisis response had evolved into something more enduring, a recognition that true security comes not from isolation, but from the strength of mutual support and shared purpose. As the sun rose higher over Whitewater Valley, Thomas knew that Reynolds and his corporate masters would regroup and adapt their approach. The conflict was far from resolved, but something fundamental had changed in the equation of power. The perception of vulnerability that had made the valley's residents targets had been replaced by the reality of collective strength. Through vibrations imperceptible to others, Thomas felt the subtle tremors of transformation moving through his community, a change more significant than the defeat of any tactical operation. Reynolds had sought to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Instead, he had catalyzed the discovery of resilience. The deaf farmer, who could feel the vibrations of gunfire before others could hear it, hadn't just defended his land, he had helped an entire community find its voice. By mid-afternoon, the immediate aftermath of the night's events had evolved into strategic repositioning on both sides. In Thomas Blackwood's command center, his core team monitored communications that revealed Reynolds' operation in full damage control mode. Encrypted transmissions intercepted by Marcus's specialized equipment painted a picture of an organization unaccustomed to failure, scrambling to adapt. Harding arrived personally, Marcus signed, after analyzing intercepted communications. Private jet landing at Bridger Falls Airport within 2 hours. Reynolds reporting directly, explaining operational failure. Carlos added tactical assessment. Security teams withdrawing from valley positions. Consolidating at Mountain View Motel. Equipment being removed from surveillance locations. Thomas nodded, understanding the significance of Alexander Harding's direct involvement. The corporate executive typically maintained distance from field operations, preserving deniability through layers of subordinates. His personal arrival indicated both the importance of Whitewater Valley to his strategic objectives and the unexpected severity of Reynolds's failure. Through his advanced vibration system, Thomas felt the rhythms of activity throughout his property. FBI agents were completing evidence collection at the locations where Reynolds' operators had been apprehended. Sheriff Hayes's deputies maintained a security perimeter around key infrastructure. Community members continued arriving to coordinate ongoing defense measures. Each created distinctive vibration patterns that Thomas's adapted senses could identify and track. Rebecca Sullivan approached from her monitoring station, her hands moving in precise signs. Neural response data from captured operators shows an interesting pattern. Disorientation from specialized systems far exceeded predicted parameters. Suggests potential for broader applications in non-lethal defense technology. This observation aligned with Thomas's own assessment. The systems they had developed, originally focused on personal adaptation to deafness, had proven remarkably effective against trained operators. The implications extended beyond their immediate situation to potential innovations in security technology that could protect vulnerable communities without causing permanent harm. Sheriff Hayes returned from coordinating with federal authorities, her expression reflecting both satisfaction and concern. 15 operators in custody county-wide, she signed, federal charges being prepared for interstate conspiracy. But Harding's legal team is already filing motions to suppress evidence and secure release. This reaction was expected. Alexander Harding commanded legal resources far beyond local capabilities, with specialized attorneys experienced in extracting operatives while maintaining corporate deniability. The federal involvement created new challenges for his legal strategy, but wouldn't stop the counteroffensive that was surely being prepared. Thomas moved to his tactical display, reviewing status updates from throughout the Valley Alliance. The Knights' coordinated defense had proven surprisingly effective, but he recognized the preliminary nature of their success. Reynolds and Harding would adapt, bringing different approaches and possibly greater resources to bear on their objective of controlling the valley's water resources. At 2:45 p.m., Thomas's secure communication system received an encrypted message from a source within the county administration. Emergency meeting called by Commissioner Wilson. Harding representatives present, discussing water quality emergency declaration for Whitewater Valley, potential for mandatory evacuation order under environmental pretense. This represented a sophisticated escalation, using regulatory mechanisms to remove residents from properties that had successfully resisted direct intimidation. A mandatory evacuation would separate the Alliance members from their lands, creating a vulnerability that Harding's operation could exploit through regulatory capture and legal maneuvering. Thomas shared this intelligence with his team, whose responses reflected their specialized expertise. Marcus immediately began accessing county emergency protocols to identify vulnerable points in the process. Carlos initiated communications with allied properties to prepare contingency measures for maintaining presence despite potential evacuation. Orders. Sheriff Hayes reviewed her department's obligations under emergency declarations, identifying discretionary elements that could be leveraged to protect resident rights. Through his vibration system, Thomas detected an approaching convoy. Multiple heavy vehicles moving with the coordinated rhythm of professional security operations. The monitors confirmed what his enhanced perception had already identified: 3 black SUVs and 2 unmarked vans approaching his access road, their positioning suggesting tactical formation rather than casual approach. Harding security detail. Marcus signed after analyzing their movement pattern. Standard executive protection configuration, lead and trail vehicles containing tactical teams, center vehicles likely carrying principals. Thomas nodded, having expected this development. Alexander Harding wouldn't allow Reynolds' operational failure to pass without direct assessment. The approach pattern confirmed tactical professionalism, but also suggested confidence in legal protection. No attempt at concealment or deniable positioning, but rather a direct approach that assumed legitimate business purpose. Sheriff Hayes moved immediately to the front of the property, positioning herself where the approaching convoy would need to acknowledge her official presence. 2 FBI agents who had been processing evidence joined her, creating a legal perimeter that would complicate any intimidation attempt. Thomas remained in his command center, monitoring through his advanced systems rather than presenting himself as an immediate target. Through specialized cameras, he observed the convoy stopping at his property boundary. The center SUV's door opened to reveal a man whose bearing immediately identified him as someone accustomed to authority without question: Alexander. Harding stood approximately 6 feet tall, his tailored suit and precise movements projecting calculated power. At 58, his silver hair and weathered features suggested experience rather than age, his physique maintained with the discipline of someone who viewed his body as another business asset to be optimized. He surveyed Thomas's farm with The assessing gaze of a predator evaluating territory. Victor Reynolds emerged from the same vehicle, his demeanor noticeably subdued compared to his previous visits. The operational failure had clearly affected his standing, his body language now deferential toward Harding rather than projecting the confident authority he had displayed earlier. From the lead and trail vehicles, 8 security personnel deployed, in professional formation, not displaying weapons, but positioned for immediate response to any perceived threat. Their movement patterns revealed extensive training, likely former military or specialized law enforcement, their coordination suggesting repeated deployment as a unit rather than individual contractors. Sheriff Hayes approached the property boundary, her official vehicle positioned to record the interaction. "This is private property," she stated with formal authority. "What's your business here, Mr. Harding?" Thomas couldn't hear the exchange that followed, but the body language was clear even through remote observation. Harding practiced charm, presenting documents that appeared to be legitimate business credentials. Reynolds remained silent, his stance suggesting diminished authority within the organization's hierarchy. The security team maintained professional alertness while avoiding provocative positioning that might justify official intervention. After several minutes of conversation, Sheriff Hayes returned to Thomas's porch, where he had positioned himself, to observe more directly. Her hands moved in efficient signs. Harding claims legitimate interest in water quality testing based on county environmental concerns. Has documentation signed by Commissioner Wilson authorizing access to test water sources. This confirmed the tactical shift Thomas had anticipated, from direct intimidation to bureaucratic maneuvering that exploited regulatory capture. Harding was implementing a more sophisticated approach, using legitimate authorities to create access that could serve multiple purposes. Thomas nodded his understanding before signing his response. "Allow limited access. 2-person team only. Direct supervision required. Documentation of all activities." Sheriff Hayes conveyed these terms to Harding, whose response was visible even from Thomas's position. The corporate executive's practiced smile remained, but his stance shifted subtly, the adjustment of someone recalculating approach based on unexpected resistance. After brief consultation with Reynolds, he agreed to the limited access, designating 2 individuals from their convoy to conduct the purported water testing. What followed demonstrated the multi-layered chess game developing between Thomas and Harding. The 2 designated technicians proceeded to Thomas's main well with Sheriff Hayes and an FBI agent accompanying them. They conducted what appeared to be legitimate water quality testing, collecting samples in properly labeled containers and documenting findings on standardized forms. Through his vibration system, however, Thomas detected activities beyond simple water testing. The technicians placed subtle markers at key infrastructure points, small electronic devices disguised as standard testing equipment that remained after the official samples were collected. Had Thomas been relying on conventional observation, these markers would have remained undetected, creating vulnerability for future operations. Instead, Thomas tracked each device through his enhanced perception, noting positions and specifications, without alerting Harding's team to his awareness. This information would prove valuable in understanding the next phase of their strategy while creating opportunity for counterintelligence operations. After completing their ostensible testing, the technicians returned to Harding's convoy. Thomas observed the interaction that followed through long-range observation equipment. The technicians reported their findings to Harding and Reynolds, their body language suggesting transmission of information beyond simple water quality results. Harding's response, visible even at distance, reflected calculated satisfaction rather than concern about potential contamination. This confirmed Thomas's assessment that the water testing was pretext rather than legitimate environmental investigation. a tactical move in a larger strategy to gain control of the valley's resources. As Harding's convoy departed, Thomas gathered his team to assess implications. The markers placed by the technicians suggested preparation for more sophisticated operations, likely coordinated activity focusing on water infrastructure throughout the valley rather than the direct property. Damage attempted previously. Classic asymmetric approach, Marcus signed after analyzing the recovered marker specifications. Transition from direct confrontation to infrastructure manipulation, creating conditions that force abandonment rather than attempting direct removal. Carlos expanded on this assessment. Markers contain advanced sensing capability, monitoring flow rates, pressure variations, chemical composition, preparing for precision intervention in water systems. Rebecca added a neurological perspective. Pattern suggests strategic rather than tactical thinking, creating a situation where resistance becomes personally costly through resource manipulation rather than direct threat. Sheriff Hayes provided regulatory context. County documentation authorizing water testing is legitimate but suspiciously broad, grants access to all water infrastructure in the valley under environmental emergency provisions. Signature from Commissioner Wilson, obtained after his agreement to cooperate with the investigation. This information painted a concerning picture of Harding's adapted strategy. Having failed with direct intimidation, he was pivoting to sophisticated infrastructure manipulation backed by regulatory capture. The approach exploited vulnerabilities in environmental emergency provisions that could supersede property rights under certain conditions. Thomas considered this assessment against his understanding of both tactical operations and adaptive strategy. Harding was implementing a classic pressure campaign against rural properties, but with resources and sophistication beyond what such communities typically encountered. The corporate structure behind him provided both financial capability and political influence that complicated conventional resistance. At 4:30 p.m., Thomas received encrypted messages from throughout the valley, Alliance reporting similar water testing visits to their properties. Each followed the same pattern: official documentation, limited teams, professional demeanor, and subtle placement of monitoring devices at critical infrastructure points. This coordinated approach confirmed Harding's strategic adaptation. Rather than attempting direct intimidation that had failed against prepared resistance, he was establishing monitoring capability throughout the valley's water system. This would enable precisely targeted infrastructure manipulation that could create conditions making continued residence untenable. Thomas shared this analysis with Alliance members through their secure communication network, providing guidance on monitoring the placed devices without removing them. This approach would allow the Alliance to track Harding's information gathering while preparing countermeasures against whatever intervention followed. By early evening, the tactical situation had evolved into complex positioning on both sides. Harding's operation had withdrawn observable presence from the valley while maintaining sophisticated monitoring capability through placed devices. The Alliance had successfully defended against direct intimidation, but now faced a more subtle threat to critical infrastructure. In his command center, Thomas reviewed comprehensive mapping of all devices placed throughout the valley. The pattern revealed professional understanding of water systems and strategic targeting of vulnerable points. Harding's team had identified locations where relatively small interventions could create maximum impact: pressure reduction points, critical junctions, primary distribution nodes. They're preparing for systematic pressure rather than dramatic action, Marcus signed after analyzing the pattern. Gradual degradation of water quality and availability rather than catastrophic failure creates plausible deniability while forcing progressive hardship. Carlos confirmed this assessment. Devices positioned for precise monitoring of impact. They'll implement incremental changes, measure effects, adjust approaches based on resistance threshold. Professional methodology. Thomas nodded, recognizing the sophistication of Harding's adapted strategy. This approach wouldn't create dramatic evidence like the previous night's attempted sabotage, but could prove more effective at achieving the ultimate objective of forcing property sales through sustained pressure on essential resources. Sheriff Hayes provided additional context from her law enforcement perspective. County testing documentation creates a legal framework for ongoing access. Challenging it requires proving bad faith, which is difficult without direct evidence of tampering. This legal dimension complicated the Alliance's response options. Direct interference with officially sanctioned testing could create vulnerability to charges of obstruction, while allowing the monitoring to continue unchallenged would enable precisely targeted infrastructure manipulation. At 7:15 p.m., Thomas received an urgent communication from Sam Walker. Water pressure dropping at North Valley Properties. County utility claims routine maintenance, no prior notification provided. Similar reports followed from other Alliance members within the hour. Properties throughout the valley were experiencing reduced water pressure or quality changes that utilities attributed to maintenance or system adjustments. The pattern aligned perfectly with the monitoring device placement, confirming implementation of Harding's infrastructure pressure strategy. Thomas gathered his core team to develop counter-strategy. The situation required a balanced response that addressed immediate resource pressure while building evidence of coordinated manipulation. Direct confrontation would play into Harding's legal framework, while passive acceptance would allow progressive degradation of essential resources. Dual approach necessary, Marcus signed, outlining initial recommendations. Independent water quality verification through certified third parties. Documented timeline of changes correlating with Harding testing access. Legal framework for emergency injunction based on critical resource interference. Carlos added tactical elements. Alternative water supply contingency for allied properties. Cooperative resource sharing through established networks. Monitoring systems for verification of intentional manipulation. Rebecca contributed technical expertise. Sensor network can document precise timing and nature of changes, creates evidence patterns demonstrating coordinated action rather than routine maintenance. Thomas integrated these recommendations into a comprehensive strategy that balanced immediate needs with long-term objectives. The Alliance would implement independent monitoring while establishing alternative supply options, creating both evidentiary foundation and practical resilience against infrastructure pressure. By 9 p.m., reports from throughout the valley indicated progressive water issues affecting all Alliance properties. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental, with properties that had most strongly resisted Harding's acquisition efforts experiencing most significant service degradation. Thomas authorized deployment of emergency water supply contingencies. The Carlos had prepared portable filtration systems, alternative source access points, cooperative distribution networks. These measures would address immediate needs, while a comprehensive response strategy is developed. At 10:30 p.m., Thomas's vibration system detected the distinctive pattern of approaching helicopters, not news aircraft, but the heavier signature of private security transport. Through specialized sensing equipment, he identified 2 helicopters approaching from the direction of Bridger Falls, their flight pattern suggesting coordinated operation rather than independent travel. The tactical implications were immediately clear. Harding was implementing aerial surveillance of the valley, likely using specialized equipment to monitor Alliance response to the infrastructure pressure. This approach provided comprehensive observation capability while maintaining legal deniability through altitude and distance. Thomas activated countermeasures developed specifically for aerial surveillance, not interference that might violate regulations, but adaptive systems that complicated data collection without creating legal vulnerability. Throughout the property, specialized lighting adjusted to patterns that disrupted certain surveillance technologies without appearing as deliberate counterintelligence. Through his command center's sophisticated monitoring systems, Thomas tracked the helicopter's movement throughout the valley. Their pattern confirmed tactical surveillance rather than transportation, systematic coverage of Alliance properties with extended hovering at critical infrastructure points. This aerial component represented significant escalation in Harding's approach. The resources required for sustained helicopter surveillance demonstrated both the importance of Whitewater Valley to his strategic objectives and his commitment to overcoming resistance through progressive pressure rather than direct confrontation. As midnight approached, Thomas gathered his core team for a comprehensive assessment of the evolving situation. The preliminary confrontation had transitioned from direct intimidation to sophisticated infrastructure manipulation, backed by advanced surveillance and regulatory exploitation. Harding was implementing classic pressure campaign methodology with resources far beyond what rural communities typically encountered. Pattern suggests three-phase strategy, Marcus signed after analyzing developments. Infrastructure degradation creates immediate pressure. Regulatory manipulation establishing a legal framework for intervention. Corporate resources sustaining pressure beyond typical resistance threshold. Carlos added tactical perspective. Approach designed to avoid direct confrontation where Alliance demonstrated effectiveness, instead creating conditions where resistance becomes progressively more costly and difficult to maintain. Rebecca contributed a neurological assessment. Strategy targets psychological vulnerabilities of independent property owners. Progressive resource restriction creates increasing stress while maintaining plausible deniability. Designed to erode collective will rather than overcome direct resistance. Sheriff Hayes provided legal context. County documentation creates a challenging framework for opposition. Environmental emergency provisions grant extensive authority with limited oversight. Requires demonstrating coordinated bad faith to effectively challenge. Thomas absorbed these perspectives, integrating them into evolving understanding of both immediate situations and broader strategic conflict. Harding's operation had demonstrated professional adaptation following initial failure, pivoting from direct intimidation to sophisticated pressure campaigns that exploited regulatory frameworks and essential infrastructure vulnerability. The preliminary confrontation had revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities on both sides. The Alliance had proven remarkably effective against direct intimidation through coordination and preparation. Harding had demonstrated sophisticated adaptive capability and resource depth that could sustain prolonged pressure campaigns. As the helicopters continued their surveillance pattern over the valley, Thomas sent secure communications to Alliance members outlining a comprehensive response strategy. The message balanced practical guidance for addressing immediate water issues with a strategic framework for documenting the coordinated nature of the pressure campaign. By 2:00 a.m., the helicopters finally departed, their vibration signatures fading as they returned toward Bridger Falls. Thomas conducted final security assessment before allowing his core team rest periods while maintaining a rotating watch schedule. The preliminary confrontation had evolved into complex positioning that would require sustained response rather than immediate resolution. Through his enhanced vibration perception, Thomas monitored the subtle rhythms of his property during the night's final hours. The monitoring devices placed by Harding's technicians continued transmitting data about his water systems. The infrastructure pressure affecting Alliance properties continued according to documented patterns. The sophisticated chess game between Whitewater Valley's residents and Harding International had entered a new phase of sustained pressure and strategic resistance. What Harding failed to recognize, what his corporate perspective couldn't fully comprehend, was the transformation occurring within the Valley community. What had begun as crisis response to external threat was evolving into something more enduring, a recognition of interdependence and collective capability that transcended immediate tactical situations. Through vibrations imperceptible to others, Thomas felt this transformation continuing, the subtle shifts in how Alliance members moved and worked together, the changing rhythms of community interaction, the emerging patterns of cooperative resource management. The preliminary confrontation had demonstrated both the threat they faced and their capacity for effective resistance when working in coordinated response. As dawn approached, Thomas prepared for the next phase of what was becoming a sustained conflict over the Valley's future. Harding had revealed both tactical sophistication and strategic commitment to his objectives. The Alliance had demonstrated unexpected effectiveness in collective defense. The preliminary confrontation had established the nature of both threat and response capability, setting parameters for the more significant conflict that would follow. What remained constant through these evolving dynamics was the foundation of Thomas's effectiveness, not despite his deafness, but because of how it had transformed his perception of the world. The vibrations that connected him to his environment with extraordinary sensitivity continued providing tactical awareness beyond what conventional perception could achieve. The adaptation that Harding perceived as vulnerability remained Thomas's most significant advantage in the unfolding conflict. 3 days of escalating pressure had transformed Whitewater Valley. What had begun as isolated intimidation attempts against individual properties had evolved into sophisticated infrastructure manipulation affecting the entire community. Alexander Harding's operation had implemented a comprehensive strategy to force capitulation through progressive resource restriction, water pressure reduced to critical levels, equality degraded through subtle chemical introduction, access points compromised through emergency maintenance that never seemed to improve conditions. Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of his eastern wheat field, the morning sun illuminating a landscape under siege not by visible invaders, but by corporate strategy leveraging regulatory capture and essential infrastructure control. Through his specialized boots, he felt the vibrations of activity throughout his property and beyond. The altered flow patterns in irrigation systems, the modified pressure dynamics in supply lines, the distinctive rhythms of community members. Implementing the cooperative resource management systems developed during emergency planning. His phone vibrated with an incoming message from Sheriff Hayes. County Commission emergency session called for 2:00 p.m. Agenda includes mandatory evacuation. Orders for Whitewater Valley under environmental emergency provisions. Harding representatives providing technical documentation supporting contamination claims. This development represented the culmination of Harding's strategy. Create infrastructure conditions that justified regulatory intervention, then use that intervention to remove residents from properties that could then be acquired through accelerated proceedings under emergency provisions. The approach exploited legal frameworks designed for legitimate environmental protection by manufacturing conditions that triggered their implementation. Thomas returned to his command center, where his core team had gathered to assess the evolving situation. Marcus Reed's hands moved in precise tactical signs. Harding's legal framework nearly complete. Environmental emergency declaration creates authority for mandatory evacuation. Property abandonment provisions allow expedited acquisition after 30 days. Timeline coordinated with water degradation to maximize pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. Carlos Vasquez added, infrastructure manipulation accelerating, chemical introduction at main junction points increasing. Water quality. Degradation approaches levels that will trigger automatic health department intervention. System designed to create conditions that force evacuation while appearing as a natural contamination event. Rebecca Sullivan provided a neurological perspective. Progressive resource restriction creating cumulative stress effects throughout the community. Sleep disruption, heightened anxiety, degraded decision-making capability, precisely calculated to erode resistance without creating actionable evidence of deliberate harm. Thomas absorbed these assessments, integrating them into comprehensive understanding of both immediate tactical situations and broader strategic conflict. Harding's operation had implemented sophisticated pressure campaigns, leveraging corporate resources, regulatory capture, and infrastructure vulnerability to achieve objectives that direct intimidation had failed to secure. What Harding couldn't calculate, however, was the transformation that had occurred within Whitewater Valley's community over those same 3 days. The alliance that had formed in response to initial threats had evolved into something more profound, not just coordinated resistance, but fundamental recognition of interdependence and collective capability. Thomas moved to the tactical display, showing real-time data from throughout the valley. The monitoring systems developed by Rebecca and implemented by Carlos provided comprehensive awareness of both infrastructure manipulation and community response. The pattern revealed both the sophistication of Harding's operation and the effectiveness of the Alliance's countermeasures. Through secure communication channels, Thomas received updates from Alliance members implementing the distributed water purification systems developed during contingency planning. The Peterson Ranch had established a centralized filtration station serving northern properties. The Miller Dairy had converted processing equipment to provide clean water for Eastern Valley residents. The Chen Farm had implemented innovative irrigation adaptations that maintained crop viability despite pressure reduction. These measures had prevented Harding's infrastructure manipulation from creating the crisis conditions needed to justify immediate evacuation. Instead of fragmentation under pressure, the community had demonstrated remarkable resilience through cooperative resource management and technological adaptation. At 10:30 a.m., Thomas's vibration system detected the now familiar pattern of Alexander, Harding's security convoy approaching his access road. The formation matched previous visits, lead and trail vehicles containing tactical teams, center SUV carrying principals, movement patterns suggesting professional security operation with corporate resources. Thomas remained in his command center, monitoring through sophisticated systems, while Sheriff Hayes positioned herself at the property boundary with federal agents who had maintained presence throughout the escalating conflict. The legal dynamics had evolved significantly since Harding's previous visit, with federal investigation formally documented and evidence preservation protocols actively implemented. Through long-range observation equipment, Thomas watched Harding emerge from his vehicle with different demeanor than his previous visit. The corporate executive's body language showed subtle indicators of stress despite maintained composure, increased tension in shoulder positioning, altered breathing pattern, micro-expressions suggesting frustration beneath professional facade. Victor Reynolds accompanied him, his status within the organization's hierarchy apparently restored based on confidence indicators in his stance and movement. This suggested adaptation in Harding's strategy, returning to intimidation specialists after infrastructure manipulation had proven less effective than anticipated against organized resistance. What followed was not an attempt at water testing or other pretextual access, but rather a direct approach to communication. Harding presented documents to Sheriff Hayes, his posture indicating official authority rather than negotiating position. Through observation equipment, Thomas could see the documents clearly: formal notice of emergency commission meeting and preliminary evacuation order pending final approval. Sheriff Hayes reviewed the documents before approaching Thomas's porch, where he had positioned himself to observe more directly. Her hands moved in efficient signs: notice of emergency declaration based on water contamination, preliminary evacuation advisory effective immediately, mandatory order likely following commission meeting. Harding offered a settlement option: immediate property purchase at reduced valuation with expedited processing for those who comply before mandatory evacuation. This represented both escalation and negotiation, leveraging manufactured emergency to create a legal framework for forced evacuation, while offering a settlement path that achieved Harding's objectives through ostensibly voluntary compliance. The approach balanced corporate acquisition strategy with regulatory manipulation, creating pressure for immediate decision rather than extended resistance. Thomas considered this development against comprehensive understanding of both tactical situations and broader strategic conflict. Harding had created conditions that established a legal framework for mandatory evacuation, but community resilience had prevented the crisis atmosphere needed to justify immediate implementation. The settlement offer represented adaptation to this unexpected resistance, providing an exit path that achieved corporate objectives while avoiding extended conflict. After brief consideration, Thomas signed his response: inform Harding settlement discussion possible after commission meeting. Valley representatives will attend with independent water quality verification and legal counsel. No decisions before full public hearing. This response served multiple strategic objectives. It prevented immediate capitulation while establishing a framework for documented public proceedings. It positioned alliance members as legitimate stakeholders in the regulatory process rather than isolated property owners. Most importantly, it created time for implementation of the final phase of Thomas's counter-strategy. Sheriff Hayes conveyed this message to Harding, whose reaction was visible even through remote observation. The corporate executive maintained professional composure, but subtle physiological indicators revealed calculation rather than confidence. The reassessment of someone encountering unexpected variables in previously established strategy. After brief consultation with Reynolds, Harding provided a response that Sheriff Hayes relayed through precise signs. Commission meeting remains scheduled. Settlement terms available only until official evacuation order. After implementation, property acquisition proceeds through emergency abandonment provisions, with significantly reduced compensation. This conditional ultimatum revealed both Harding's confidence in regulatory control and concern about extended resistance. The accelerated timeline suggested the importance of rapid resolution to broader corporate strategy, likely connected to regional water acquisition objectives documented in earlier intelligence gathering. After Harding's convoy departed, Thomas gathered his core team for implementation of the counter-strategy developed during contingency planning. The approaching commission meeting represented both culmination of Harding's pressure campaign and opportunity for alliance response that could fundamentally alter conflict dynamics. Tactical situation, approaching decision point, Marcus signed, outlining assessment of immediate priorities. Harding has established a legal framework through regulatory capture and manufactured environmental concerns. Commission meeting designed as procedural formality rather than actual deliberation. Our counter-strategy must address both technical environmental claims and procedural legitimacy. Carlos added tactical elements. Documentation packages complete for all infrastructure manipulation incidents. Technical evidence correlating device placement with water quality changes. Witness statements regarding observed tampering activities. Physical evidence secured through chain of custody protocols. Rebecca contributed a specialized perspective. Independent laboratory analysis confirms artificial introduction of contaminants rather than natural occurrence. Chemical signatures match compounds found in Harding technical vehicles. Timeline establishes a clear pattern of deliberate manipulation coinciding with access gained through county authorization. Sheriff Hayes provided law enforcement context. Federal investigators prepared to present preliminary findings regarding organized conspiracy, documented evidence sufficient for initial injunctive relief pending complete investigation. County commissioners are legally vulnerable if they proceed with an evacuation order against federal recommendation. Thomas integrated these elements into a comprehensive approach for the commission meeting. The alliance would present not just opposition to evacuation orders, but compelling evidence of manipulated environmental emergency and coordinated corporate conspiracy. The strategy addressed both immediate regulatory threat and broader conflict over the valley's future. At 1:00 p.m., Thomas received an encrypted message from Jason Miller. Federal Regulatory Intervention Authorized. EPA Emergency Response Team. Deploying to Whitewater Valley based on evidence of deliberate water system tampering. Arrival estimated during commission meeting. Superseding jurisdiction established through interstate water protection provisions. This development transformed the tactical landscape. Federal intervention would override county regulatory authority, particularly given documented evidence of manufactured environmental concerns. Harding's carefully constructed legal framework suddenly faced challenges from regulatory authority. Beyond his established influence, Thomas shared this intelligence with alliance members through a secure communication network, coordinating presentation strategy for the commission meeting. The approach would balance presentation of manipulation evidence with procedural cooperation with federal authorities, creating a framework for legitimate environmental assessment rather than manufactured emergency. By 1:30 p.m., the Whitewater Valley Alliance had gathered at the County Administration Building in Clearwater. Each family brought documentation specific to their property: water quality samples, maintenance records, observed tampering evidence. Technical experts recruited through Rebecca's research network provided independent analysis confirming artificial contamination. Legal representatives secured through Marcus's connections prepared procedural objections to expedited evacuation order. Thomas arrived last, accompanied by his core team and Sheriff Hayes. Through his vibration-sensing boots, he felt the distinctive patterns of nervous energy throughout the building. County officials uncomfortable with growing federal presence. Harding representatives calculating strategic adjustments. Community members determined despite ongoing pressure. The commission chamber filled beyond capacity, with alliance members occupying most available seating. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe both commissioners and Harding's representatives, his enhanced perception providing awareness of subtle reactions and communications invisible to conventional observation. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Commission Chairman Wilson called the emergency session to order. His vibration pattern revealed profound discomfort, elevated heart rate, irregular breathing, micro-adjustments in posture indicating a person under significant stress. The corruption investigation following earlier events had clearly affected his approach to Harding's objectives. The meeting began with a technical presentation from Harding's environmental consultants, professional experts presenting data suggesting significant water contamination throughout Whitewater Valley. Their analysis recommended immediate evacuation based on health risk assessment and infrastructure vulnerability. The presentation was technically impressive and would have been compelling without context of manufactured conditions. When Alliance representatives began presenting counter-evidence, Thomas felt a vibration pattern of unexpected arrivals. Multiple individuals entering the building with the coordinated movement signature of federal agents. Through his specialized perception, he tracked their approach to the commission chamber, noting the distinctive rhythm of official purpose rather than casual attendance. As Sam Walker presented documentation of observed tampering at his ranch's water connection points, the chamber doors opened to admit 5 individuals whose credentials created immediate impact. The lead agent approached the commission table directly, presenting federal authorization that visibly affected Chairman Wilson's demeanor. "This proceeding is now under federal environmental protection jurisdiction," the agent announced to the chamber. "EPA preliminary investigation has established reasonable suspicion of deliberate water system tampering constituting potential violation of Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act provisions. All evacuation proceedings are suspended pending comprehensive federal assessment." The vibration patterns throughout the room transformed instantly. Commissioners showing relief at external intervention, removing immediate decision pressure. Harding representatives displaying controlled alarm at unforeseen complications. Alliance members experiencing cautious optimism at procedural interruption of evacuation process. Alexander Harding himself showed remarkable composure despite tactical setback, his physiological response indicating strategic calculation rather than emotional reaction. Thomas tracked these subtle indicators through his enhanced perception, noting Harding already preparing a secondary approach rather than abandoning primary objectives. What followed was procedural transfer of environmental assessment authority from county to federal jurisdiction. The EPA team presented preliminary findings based on evidence provided through Sheriff Hayes and federal investigators, establishing a framework for comprehensive investigation rather than immediate emergency response. The critical outcome, suspension of evacuation proceedings pending complete federal assessment, represented significant victory for the Alliance. Harding's carefully constructed regulatory approach had encountered authority beyond his established influence, creating time and space for legitimate environmental evaluation rather than manufactured emergency. As the commission meeting concluded, with formal acknowledgement of federal jurisdiction, Thomas observed the subtle communication between Harding and Reynolds. Their body language indicated tactical repositioning rather than strategic abandonment, adaptation to unexpected development rather than cessation of acquisition objectives. Through his vibration system, Thomas felt a distinctive pattern of Harding approaching him directly as the chamber cleared. The corporate executive moved with deliberate purpose, positioning himself where conversation could appear private despite potential observation. "Impressive coordination, Mr. Blackwood," Harding stated, his words interpreted by Sheriff Hayes, standing nearby. "Federal intervention was unexpected but ultimately changes little. Regulatory delays are temporary. Corporate resources are patient. The fundamental economics remain unchanged. This valley's water resources are simply too valuable in a changing climate reality." Thomas studied Harding carefully before signing his response, which Sheriff Hayes interpreted. "You've misunderstood something fundamental about Whitewater Valley. These aren't just properties, they're homes. These aren't just resources, they're livelihoods. And these aren't just isolated individuals, they're a community. Harding's expression reflected calculated reassessment rather than emotional response. Communities can be broken through sustained pressure, Mr. Blackwood. Resources ultimately flow toward their highest economic value. That's not corporate strategy, it's fundamental reality. Thomas's response, again interpreted by Sheriff Hayes, got to the heart of the conflict. You targeted this valley because you saw isolation as vulnerability. You targeted me because you saw deafness as weakness. Both calculations were fundamentally flawed. This exchange revealed the contrasting perspectives at the core of the conflict. Harding viewed Whitewater Valley through a corporate lens that reduced land to assets, water to resources, and people to obstacles. Thomas and the Alliance understood the valley as an interconnected community where collective strength emerged from individual commitment to shared home. As Harding departed with his representatives, Thomas gathered with Alliance members to assess the tactical situation. The federal intervention had created breathing space by suspending the immediate evacuation threat, but all recognized the temporary nature of this victory. Harding's resources and determination remained unchanged. His strategic objectives still focused on acquiring the valley's water rights. What had changed fundamentally, however, was the Alliance's position. Federal investigation created documented evidence of corporate conspiracy. Regulatory intervention established legitimate environmental assessment rather than manufactured emergencies. Most importantly, community cohesion had transformed isolated vulnerability into collective resilience. In the days that followed, Thomas's farm became a coordination center for valley-wide restoration of water infrastructure. Federal investigators documented comprehensive evidence of deliberate tampering, creating legal liability that extended beyond local operators to corporate direction. EPA assessment established actual water quality significantly better than presented in Harding's manufactured data, removing justification for emergency evacuation. Most significantly, national media attention focused on Whitewater Valley's successful resistance against corporate water acquisition strategy. Investigative journalists connected the Montana situation to similar operations in other drought-vulnerable regions, revealing a pattern of exploitation that attracted regulatory and legislative attention. 2 weeks after the suspended commission meeting, Thomas received an encrypted message from Michael Turner at the FBI. Federal grand jury indictments forthcoming against Reynolds and 3 primary operators for conspiracy, environmental crimes, and interstate fraud. Corporate investigation expanded to Harding international leadership based on documented direction of field operations. Recommend maintaining security protocols until formal proceedings complete. This development represented significant victory, but not final resolution. Legal proceedings would require extended commitment from Alliance members as witnesses and documentation providers. Harding International's resources would fund sophisticated defense strategy and potential appeal process. The fundamental conflict over rural water resources in climate-changed reality remained active in regulatory, legal, and political arenas. What had been resolved, however, was the immediate threat to Whitewater Valley's residents and their continued connection to lands that represented both livelihood and heritage. The alliance that had formed under pressure had evolved into enduring community structure for cooperative resource management and mutual support. The corporate strategy of isolation and intimidation had not just failed, but backfired, creating stronger collective identity than had existed before external threat. 1 month after the suspended evacuation order, Thomas stood in his eastern wheat field at dawn, feeling the vibrations of his land through specialized boots that connected him to the subtle rhythms of his environment. The irrigation systems had been restored to full functionality after federal intervention. The monitoring devices placed by Harding's operators had been documented and removed under official supervision. The crops that had been threatened by the manufactured water crisis were thriving under resumed proper management. Beyond his own property, Thomas felt the vibrations of community activity throughout the valley, the distinctive patterns of farming operations resuming normal function, the movement of shared water management systems developed during crisis response, the regular rhythms of rural life continuing despite attempted disruption. Through the earth itself, he felt the pulse of a community that had discovered its collective strength. Sarah Henderson approached across the field, having adopted sign language with remarkable speed during the weeks of coordinated resistance. Her hands moved with growing confidence. The County Commission approved a new water rights protection ordinance yesterday. Federal guidelines integrated into local regulations, significantly higher barriers to corporate acquisition strategies. This represented institutional adaptation following community resistance, regulatory frameworks evolving to address vulnerabilities exploited during Harding's operation. Similar measures were being considered in other rural counties facing comparable corporate water acquisition pressure. Thomas nodded his appreciation for the update before signing his response. The most effective defense comes from adaptation. To challenge, true for individuals, communities, and institutions. This principle had proven central to both his personal journey following hearing loss and the Valley's response to corporate threat. Adaptation transformed apparent limitation into unexpected strength. Perceived vulnerability became the foundation for unprecedented resilience when approached through innovative perspective rather than conventional assumption. As Thomas walked back toward his farmhouse, he felt the vibrations of approaching vehicles, not the threatening rumble of Harding's security convoy, but the familiar patterns of alliance members gathering for their weekly coordination meeting. What had begun as an emergency response had evolved into ongoing community governance structure, with rotating leadership and distributed responsibility for shared resources. Through his command center's monitoring systems, Thomas watched the gathered community with profound appreciation for their collective journey. These independent, prideful farmers and ranchers had discovered that true strength often emerges not despite vulnerability, but through how challenge transforms perspective and practice. Sheriff Hayes arrived last, bringing updated information from federal investigators still documenting the full scope of Harding's operation. Her hands moved in efficient signs. Reynolds cooperating with prosecution following indictment, providing evidence of similar operations in 3 other states, corporate structure increasingly exposed to legal liability. This development suggested broader implications beyond Whitewater Valley's immediate victory. The documented resistance against Harding's operation was creating legal precedent and public awareness that could transform corporate approach to rural resource acquisition throughout drought-vulnerable regions. As the meeting progressed, Thomas reflected on the journey, from isolated intimidation to community transformation. Reynolds and his men had targeted him specifically because they saw his deafness as vulnerability to exploitation. They couldn't comprehend how that apparent limitation had become the foundation for extraordinary capability. The enhanced vibration, sensitivity that provided tactical awareness beyond conventional perception. Similarly, Harding had targeted Whitewater Valley because he saw rural isolation as fundamental vulnerability. He couldn't understand how that perceived weakness could transform into remarkable strength when independent individuals recognized their essential interdependence and shared commitment to a common home. Through vibrations imperceptible to others, Thomas felt the subtle rhythms of community gathering in his home, the distinctive patterns of people who had moved from neighbors to allies to something deeper through shared challenge. What had begun as crisis response had evolved into enduring connection based on mutual respect and recognition of complementary capabilities. The victory against Harding International wasn't the final resolution in ongoing conflict over rural resources in changing climate reality. Legal proceedings would continue for months or years. Regulatory frameworks would require continuous defense against corporate influence. The fundamental economic pressures driving water acquisition strategies remained active throughout drought-vulnerable regions. What had changed permanently, however, was Whitewater Valley itself. The community that had discovered its collective strength would never return to vulnerable isolation. The cooperative systems developed under pressure had created enduring resilience against future threats. The perception of interdependence had transformed independent individuals into connected communities with shared commitment to preserving their way of life. As Thomas looked across the gathered alliance members, he recognized the most significant outcome of their successful resistance. Beyond specific tactical victory against corporate acquisition, they had demonstrated fundamental truth about human potential, that apparent limitations often contain seeds of extraordinary strength when approached through adaptive perspective. Rather than conventional assumption, the deaf farmer who could feel vibrations imperceptible to others had helped his community discover that true victory comes not from overwhelming power, but from transforming perceived vulnerability into unexpected capability. In doing so, they had written a new chapter in the ongoing story of rural communities, defending essential connections to land and water against forces that would reduce both to mere commodities in global resource markets. Through the earth itself, Thomas felt the vibrations of this transformed community, their movements, their interactions, their shared purpose. In the silence that had become his world 15 years earlier, he had discovered a connection more profound than sound could convey. In the challenge Harding had presented to their valley, this community had found strength more enduring than isolation had permitted. The vibrations told a story that words could never fully express, how limitation becomes capability through adaptation, how vulnerability transforms into resilience through connection, and how silence itself can become the foundation for extraordinary perception when conventional assumptions give way to innovative possibility. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.